Okay, this is about to be one of the most probably challenging episodes of the entire series. So, yeah, what to say? Well, at this point, what I want to do is um, I'm trying to approach genuine understanding of the significance of what Jung means by the uniting symbol. And the reason that I want to do that is so that I can talk about the section in chapter 5, the significance of the uniting symbol, and then the Brahmanic conception of the problem of opposites. So we start using these Eastern analogies. But before that, I'm I've realized that the problem I'm attempting to I'm demonstrating a problem, which is that there is actually no way to um, explain this problem of 3 and 4 that I've been speaking of in terms of this quote from Maria Prophetessa: one becomes two, two becomes three, and from the third comes the one as the fourth. And the reason for that is that um, theoretical language, like the language of philosophy, let's say, um, is inherently dichotomizing, um, which I will demonstrate throughout. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to be using Jung as an aid, and that's going to be difficult. Someone ought to already have an understanding of the major Jungian themes by watching the episode where I drew all of that together. And the reason for that is because we're going to go beyond what Jung meant. Um, so what I'm going to do is attempt to solve a problem, and I'm going to intentionally fail at solving that problem. I'm going to try to solve it, but the thing is that it can't be solved using the form of language that I have been and am still using. And what that will show us is the importance of symbols, the reason why they are the only, yeah, structures and phenomena um, capable of mm, solving the split that I've been speaking of. The reason that it's going to be difficult is because although I'm going to be quoting Jung, I'm going to be drawing an interpretation, meaning certain meanings from what he's saying that he did not necessarily intend. Um, okay. And it's again that same section from chapter 2. I'm going to give a few key quotes and mention them. So from page 105, he says, in practice, opposites can be united only in the form of a compromise or irrationally, some new thing arising between them, which, although different from both, yet has the power to take up their energies in equal measure, as an expression of both and neither. Okay, already we see that there is a problem of opposites in some way. This relates to the from 1, 2, from when there is a unity and it falls into multiplicity, essentially. There is a split condition. There is the fall into history, right? And we've been dealing with that problem ever since, chase it as far back as you want. I did it with stone tools. That's a pretty long way, 3.4 million years. In practice, opposites can only be united in the form of a compromise or irrationally, as some new thing arising between them. So this would be the 3 that the quote points to, from 1, 2, from 2, 3, right? And we're going to be qualifying that as we go along. So the way to unite opposites is in the form of some sort of compromise. Something arises between them, and it's different from both, but they both contribute to it. Okay, and he says such an expression cannot be contrived by reason. It's not something that can be reasonably or rationally delivered in the way that I've been attempting. It can only be created through living. It can only be created through living. Yeah, it's a creative process which emerges from close to the source of life itself. And arguably, when I speak in this, like let's say rational way, it's not close enough to the source of life to really solve the problem that we're trying to solve, namely to reunify the split between opposites. Yep. Um, yeah, there's an important quote from Schiller here, which I would like to mention. On the same page, it says, but if there were cases when man had this twofold experience at the same time. What does that mean? Well, imagine that, again, this dichotomizing the pairs of opposites, imagine that we could hold that within our own experience. If there were cases when man had this twofold experience at the same time, when he was at once, meaning at the same time, conscious of his freedom and sensible of his existence. Okay, immediately we see there these two pairs of opposites that are with each other. So there's conscious and unconscious, and free and sensible. So by conscious and free, we sort of mean this open space of awareness, right? And sensible of existence, we mean the felt sense of being grounded in actual existence, actual life. Schiller says, when he at once felt himself as matter and came to know himself as mind. So again, it's both, it's matter and mind, conscious and unconscious, 3 and 4. He would in such cases, and positively in them alone, have a complete intuition of his humanity. And the object which afforded him this intuition would serve him as a symbol of his accomplished destiny. So Schiller is describing this way of, if we can hold this tension of opposites within our own being, we then derive an intuition of his humanity. What I'm connecting there is, again, the etymology of humble, humility, and human, which is a quality of being close to the core of our true essence, which I would say is inherently mysterious. So it's a being grounded in that. So there's which is inherently irrational, we can see. It's not a rational ground. He says, the object which afforded him this intuition would serve him as a symbol of his accomplished destiny. Okay, we can already see there that that intuition about which Schiller is speaking, that can ground one in one's experience. So when one holds the opposites within oneself, one can have an intuition of one's, let's say, deepest humanity. And it's an object that allows that intuition. What kind of object? Well, it serves as a symbol of his accomplished destiny. Okay, so there's a kind of perception of an object or symbol, or a symbol which has objective qualities, but its qualities aren't limited to the objective, which is capable of reunifying the opposites as held within an inner condition, according to Schiller. Jung then says, thus, if a man were able to live both faculties or instincts at the same time, then out of that experience, which Schiller calls the object, a symbol would arise. Which would express his accomplished destiny. And what we mean by that here is that Jung thinks about holding this inner pair of opposites in terms of tension between what he calls the superior and inferior function. So he's thinking about thinking and feeling, or we could say sensing and intuiting. If we can hold these different facultative pairs of opposites within us, and live both of them, then out of that experience, a symbol would arise. We can see here that the importance for Jung of allowing oneself to live the instincts, faculties, or preferences that one would not normally allow of oneself. Specifically for Jung, his persona was very masculine, scholarly, wise old man kind of figure. And so there was a lot of thinking for Jung. This is this superior function, let's say. And so he had to allow the qualities of Kali, the negative feminine, to be present within himself, which he connected with eros and with feeling and with pleasure. And it was when he was able to live that as well, meaning when he was able to live both functions within himself, that out of that experience, a symbol arose, which, quote, would express his accomplished destiny, his individual way. Yep. So the idea is that there is the passage of life onward between pairs of opposites is blocked in some way, and that there is an internal process of symbol production resulting from living close to the core of one's humanity. And that symbol production results in a new way of life, a new direction for life to take. moving on. Schiller says at the bottom of that page, the object of the mediating function, therefore, according to Schiller, is, this is Jung, sorry, according to Schiller, is a living form. For this would be precisely a symbol in which the opposites are united. So it's a form which is also living. We can see there in this concept living form. So it's not just a symbol. It has a combination of logos and eros. It has the formed, or sort of, it's a combination of Apollonian and Dionysian form around life and life itself. Or we could say form and essence, or yeah, that will do. So we're not just looking for a symbol, we're looking for a potent symbol, a symbol full of life, living form in which the opposites are united. Yep. Importantly, Jung says on the next page, 106, but the symbol presupposes a function that creates symbols, and in addition, a function that understands them. So there's a combination in this. So we're looking here, we're pointing to the thing that unites conflicts between opposites is some kind of living form or living symbol that naturally arises from the living within the experience of one's internal conflict. And that for that living form or symbol to naturally arise, there must be a function that creates it and a function that understands it. So there's a kind of creative and receptive polarity as well. So we're holding, it's also the capacity to hold both of those. It's the, again, it's the drawing of all threads into oneself. So there's the capacity to create symbols and the capacity to understand symbols in a feedback. Because the process that we're looking for is a process capable of unifying all and any pairs of opposites within oneself. Yes. He says on that same page 106, quote, the essence of the symbol consists in the fact that it represents in itself something that is not wholly understandable, and that it hints only intuitively at its possible meaning. The creation of a symbol is not a rational process, for a rational process could never produce an image that represents a content which is at bottom incomprehensible. This is an incredibly important condition of the right way to go about engaging this process. It's it cannot be wholly understood, this living symbol, and therefore, if it is consciously designed or created, it will not have that quality. And I think Jung would say that it is therefore there's too much conscious contribution and not enough contribution from the unconscious. So this is an articulation of some sort of design parameters. And the thing is that design is itself one of the things that we're going to want to ultimately avoid. It's because the essence of this living symbol that we're looking for is that it represents in itself something not wholly understandable. Which is therefore, I would like to say that this process of symbol formation about which Jung is speaking, it could have rational and irrational elements, and it could be appropriately contributed to by one's rationality and by one's irrationality. And I think we can therefore see that, yes, the entire process of creation of this symbol may not be a rational process, but it may have rational elements or rational components, and as well as irrational elements and irrational components. So some of it may be understandable, and aspects of it may be able to be contributed by the designing mind. Now, moving on, we're looking for, so here we're describing what is this, again, if the opposites are represented by 1 becomes 2, then if we're holding that 2, any 2 in creative tension, then we're looking at then between those 2 is the 3 and the 4 that we're talking about in terms of this quote. So now we're moving toward articulating what are those 3 and 4 represent. And we sort of talked about how at the basis of that 3 and 4 is a living symbol. So this living symbol, which is capable of uniting any pairs of opposites, is connected with the 3 and 4 in the quote that we've been talking about. And we're attempting to understand how it is connected and maybe why also. Now, you're going to see here as we move into this that this dichotomizing dualistic structure within us, which is archetypal, is so deep that it's going to continue to recur in my thinking, which is going to be a mistake. Now, Jung says on page 106, for as a matter of fact, something does stand between the opposites, but in the pure differentiated type, it has become invisible. What does Jung mean by this? Well, he talks about how in the condition of the split, meaning it's split into multiplicity, split into 2, 1 becomes 2, this is reflected within us, within the structure of our being, within our psyches, where these functions about which Jung speaks, thinking, feeling, sensing, and intuiting, have themselves become split, meaning these faculties have no unity, have no integration. And if there were a phenomena, such as a living symbol, for example, that were only able to be perceived from out of the perceptual capacity of those functions in their unity, then it would appear as invisible. What do I mean by that? I mean that imagine that this living symbol exists. Imagine that it does exist. Imagine that it is beneath the surface of our awareness. Imagine that it is implicit within our awareness and invisible to us at the current time. Imagine that it was invisible because our faculties, which we could talk about in many ways, the way that Jung talks about our faculties is in terms of thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition. Imagine that they had to be drawn together in some way for this living symbol to be brought into conscious view. Yes, Jung mentions importantly, again on page 106, in the introvert, it is what I've called feeling sensation. What does he mean by this? Well, Jung is again speaking expertly about his own typology, but also that of people who might identify like myself as introverts. He talks about importantly, not just that we have 4 different functions, but that there is importantly a superior and inferior function, meaning one function that for Jung and myself is thinking, or it's like a combination of thinking and intuition. And beneath that, let's say, the inferior function is more contaminated with the unconscious and is more about the faculties of sensing and feeling. And so yes, what this allows Jung to say or reveal is that it is these functions that are more connected with the unconscious, that are closer to the unconscious, that would first come into contact with this living symbol as it emerges into consciousness. So namely, we could anticipate that it may be something that is first able to be sensed and felt rather than thought and intuited. But this is only in the person whose dominant function is thinking and intuition, let's say. So the key there would be whatever faculties are closer to the unconscious have a perceptive advantage in this situation. Okay, so we've been talking about the nature of the uniting symbol, which is naturally arises from the source of life, that is capable of mediating the tension between any pair of opposites. And we've been talking about its implicit nature and its sort of invisible, like that we can't perceive it properly, but then we're looking for how to bring it into conscious awareness in the hope that it will help us to unify dichotomies between pairs of opposites, any pairs of opposites, especially when we live them within ourselves. Okay. And importantly, I could mention at this point that that process is connected with the transition from an introverted condition into an extroverted condition, where we've sort of introverted the conflict by living the conflict within ourselves, for example, between different faculties like thinking and feeling. The idea is that then the symbol would be able to emerge into extroverted condition, by which we mean the symbol could emerge into view, into conscious view, and then what? Then there's a way that there's a transition from east to west there, from introversion to extroversion, from an emergent process of the symbol coming up within us to contributing it, speaking it in relation to natural forms. We'll talk more about that transition later on. It's just important to know that that's what's going on as well at this point. Now, again, we're talking about what is this third and fourth that mediate this pair of opposites? Well, it's a living symbol, but Jung also says the third element in which the opposites merge is fantasy activity, which is creative and receptive at once. So it's, quote, fantasy activity, meaning there's something. So fantasy activity indicates to me qualities of serious play, of spontaneity, of playful attitude. Fantasy having to do with imagination, use of the imaginal, use of all one's capacities when we play, creative and receptive, So Jung's idea is that it's only fantasy activity that is able to unite creative and receptive, essentially. And therefore Schiller begins to talk about the play instinct. So we mentioned play in this context, but this ends up being a problem because there's something aesthetic about that. And we saw from the discussion of Schiller and Nietzsche that the aesthetic attitude of play is insufficient, not heavy or weighty enough to really hold the tension between the conflict of any opposites, which can be murderous and powerful and very strong. So Jung says, a third factor is needed, which at least can equal the other two in seriousness. With the attitude of play, all seriousness must vanish. And what Jung means by that essentially is that the quality of play might be important, but it's also very neuroanatomically fragile, meaning that when there is a deep conflict or dichotomy that is being addressed, play goes very quickly offline. So we need a deeper faculty, a third factor, which can really hold the two in tension. Okay, we've now moved to page 108. Yes, and so Jung clarifies why it can't be a focus on the aesthetic, and it can't be a romantic faculty. It can't be having something to do with just play, because Schiller connects those with beauty, and Jung points out that another way of stating the problem that we've been discussing, it's the conflict between opposites. It's man in his fallen state. It's the fall into split consciousness. It's essentially the metacrisis. And so another way of framing the problem of how do we talk about this mediating symbol that is capable of reuniting pairs of opposites or any dichotomy? Another way of stating that problem is, how is man to emerge from the state of barbarism, according to Jung? So this is awareness that there is a conflict, there is in the world, meaning life cannot progress because we're about to blow ourselves up. So how can we emerge from the state of barbarism? So there's a very practical and real conflict between opposites. And so this is the predicament of life, the world situation, stated in terms of conflict between opposites that we're attempting to solve by clarifying the nature of some mediating function, which has a combination of creative and receptive, irrational and rational elements, and importantly has qualities that reveal it as a living symbol. Okay, and play and an orientation to beauty are not enough. And we can also see that even just logically, because beauty is necessarily juxtaposed with ugliness, simply by being defined like beauty qua beauty can only be defined as such in comparison to ugliness. And so this is how Jung rejects the aestheticism. It has to be something that partakes of what, quote, both instincts. Yeah, Jung says, above all, therefore, it must definitely be established where man actually stands in his innermost being. He's in opposition to himself, hence he must stand somewhere in between. In his deepest essence, he must be a being who partakes of both instincts. Yes. So, I don't think that's so important. I think that's pretty obvious. There's a quality of, it's not something that's just made up, it's not something that's on the surface. It has to do with the core of our being and the conflict that goes to the core of our being. So Jung also says importantly there, in his deepest essence, he must be a being who partakes of both instincts. So by both instincts, we mean any two. So let's say thinking and feeling, any two. He says, yet may also differentiate himself from them in such a way that though he must suffer them, and in some cases submit to them, he can also use them. So notice that although, for example, I just gave the example of this conflict between opposites in terms of thinking and feeling, or between any of the pairs of opposites that we've been naming. But the thing about this is that we are beings who have this capacity to hold tension within us, to hold conflict between opposites within us, and to, by holding that creative tension, recognize that we are more than that creative tension. Right? So if we are holding that tension within us, we must, by definition, we must necessarily be more than it. And therefore, this is what Jung means by differentiate oneself from that conflict between opposites. So there is a space into which, from out of which, that conflict between opposites plays. And so Jung connects that quality of differentiation. It has a quality of this has to do with the concept of self-emptying or kenosis, where if we identify a deep conflict between opposites, instead of identifying with one or the other, we can recognize that we are both. There's elements of us that correspond to any dichotomy that we can connect with, but also neither, in the sense that there's an aspect of our nature which is not reduced in any way to anything definable. But even there, we can say that like we can hold the definable and the indefinable within us, right? Okay. He says, Jung on page 108, here it seems to me Schiller has put his finger on something very important, namely the possibility of separating out an individual nucleus, which can be at one time the subject and at another the object of the opposing functions, although always remaining distinguishable from them. So importantly, we see there that this conflict between the opposites, the mediating between those opposites, like I talked about that quality of mediation within oneself, right, as connecting with the quality of spaciousness, that there is a space within which that creative tension can be held. But that spaciousness, the freedom of space that willfully holds the creative tension within it, there is the possibility of having a nucleus, namely a living symbol, emerge out of that spaciousness that can hold the creative tension from out of itself. And it has elements of both subject and object within us. So it can imagine that this living symbol about which we're speaking, well, we can say, using a good example of Christ as a living symbol, right? And so in some way, we can see that this living symbol is able to be a subject, is able to be a center of awareness, and that one can relate with the conflict of opposites from out of that center of awareness, right? So it has elements of subjectivity. However, at another time, it can also be related to as an object, meaning if one is, I think I would like to say, if one is relating to the conflict of opposites, it's usually from the point of view of a subject. But if one is relating to that emerging symbol from the point of view of the conflicting opposites, then it would appear more as an object. And there is a kind of feedback cycle or process between those as well, where ultimately we're going to be wanting to talk about a process which has elements of subjective and objective, meaning that it's a transjective, self-generative process. Yes, because this living symbol which is emerging to hold the creative attention between pairs of opposites, it is both subject and object, much as we are both subject and object. Okay. We're now moving to page 109. This is an important quote here from Dionysius, who mentions of this mediating symbol, which he calls a spirit. He says of the spirit, the fantastic spirit is the medium between the eternal and the temporal, and in it we are most alive. Yep, so in it we are most alive, meaning it goes up to what is most high and down to what is most low. It has the quality of mediating the eternal and the temporal, the time-bound and not bound within time as well. Again, any pair of opposites. Okay. Okay, we just want to mention briefly at the bottom of page 109, Jung was discussing demonism in this context. But we also want to mention this quote here. I was talking about the differentiation from the different pairs of opposites, right? And it says, hence, if the individuality, by which Jung ultimately means the self, if the individuality fails to differentiate itself from the opposites, it becomes identical with them and is inwardly torn asunder, so that a state of agonizing disunion arises. So this is a quality here where this individual nucleus, which is emerging, which is a kind of living symbol capable of uniting any pairs of opposites, that we can bring into the edges of our conscious awareness by holding the creative tension between our different faculties within us, and by disidentifying ourselves progressively from those faculties or from any inner union. That quality of disidentification is important because when we recognize that we are not, so when we're in this like a dichotomized dualistic way of thinking, there's an oppositionality to, we're always confronting, right? It's an I-it kind of relationship. But when there's the possibility of relating from out of agape to relating in I-thou terms to this individual nucleus, then what can be contributed is it can be brought into independent awareness. It can be brought into individuality. It can be brought into ultimately personhood. So this is the contribution of the I-thou relationship and agape to the establishing of the individuality of the self, and that allows it to differentiate itself from any pairs of opposites, from our subjective awareness and as an object as well. And this is important so that it isn't inwardly torn apart. It has to be differentiated from any pairs of opposites. And our attitude, our will, and our contributing of care, our contributing of agape, our parenting, is a critical aspect of that. Yep, and importantly, when that fails, again, which is what we've been discussing, Dionysius says on page 110, thus the animal spirit, which devout men have also called the spiritual soul, becomes both idol and god and demon of many shapes. In this also does the soul express her torment. I guess, so to say that it is from out of one soul that one is closest to the awareness of this emerging self-center, this emerging nucleus, this emerging living symbol. And when one is not able to disidentify from the different pairs of opposites, then one soul remains split. And so there's a quality of being tormented that is exhibited in that condition. So I won't. Yes, so to say that Jung notices that sensing and thinking, namely these instincts, are quote collective functions. I guess I wonder if he thinks of perception and feeling as individual functions. I'm not sure at this point. So for the moment, I'm going to argue that all the functions, thinking, feeling, sensation, and perception, all have a collective aspect, by which I mean they have that we have a tendency to identify with them, meaning that they tend to be divisive. They tend to split us into many. And so in order for this emerging center of consciousness not to be split into many, exhibiting the failure condition that we were just talking about, Jung asked the question, by virtue of what power does that which is indivisible, the individual, defend himself against the divisive instincts? So importantly here, Jung is talking about this way that these sensory faculties, Jung talks about them as the cognitive functions, thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition. He thinks that they have an inherently collective quality, meaning he's looking for something. He's looking for a power that is able to preserve the individuality of this emerging nucleus, the emerging self-center, the emerging living symbol, such that it isn't divided by our identification with these different faculties of ours. And so then the question is, what is that? Again, we've talked about how it's not just play and spontaneity. He says, it must be something serious, some considerable power, that can effectively detach the individuality from both the opposites. Schiller says, this twofold compulsion naturally cancels itself out, and the will preserves complete freedom between them both. Thus, it is the will which acts as a power against both instincts. Okay. This is important here because we can see that if Jung is right about those collective functions, that we have our sensing, intuiting, thinking and feeling are extremely powerful and valuable qualities and faculties which are available to us, but they also come with an inherent vulnerability, which is that they tend to split apart the unity of the emerging self-center. And for example, when this symbol begins to arise, it can be exciting, it can be terrifying, it can be quite activating, and we can fall back into this dichotomizing by identifying with different aspects of our split nature, by identifying with what is high, what is low, by identifying with what is human or inhuman, by identifying with our thinking or our feeling, or anything that can be put in terms of opposites. And Jung's arguing that the way to defend against this is by the distribution of the will. So it's both the will within us, and so here we start talking about the will. So what do we mean by that? We mean that the will is a kind of focusing quality. It's a kind of directedness or self-determining or orienting. It has a quality of seriousness and power. It comes from somewhere and goes to somewhere. So the idea would be that when there is a certain process that starts to arise, when it does start to arise, that is so amazing that we fall back into our collectivity. We fall back into the divisive instincts, and the individual identity cannot be preserved. And so the idea is that the will has a certain function, if it is directed properly, which we're going to keep talking about, to preserve or to keep oriented, to keep focused on what is most important, and not let that go. As Schiller said, the will preserves complete freedom between them, both. Thus, it is the will which acts as power against both instincts. Okay. So the idea here is that we can see that this conflict between opposites, right? This dichotomizing split condition, this fallen state, dropping down into many. This is very robust tendency. So it keeps happening, keeps tending to happen. And so the idea is that the will is a faculty that is strong enough to continue to hold open creative tension between opposites. So now we're going to keep exploring how the will does that. And so Jung says, this is top of page 111. He says that, logically Schiller was right to point out what he did about the will, but practically we're still not sure how it can do this. And he says, the will could indeed decide the issue, but only if we anticipate the very condition that must first be reached. This is extremely important quality. So there's a way that so the will would have to be oriented towards a future condition, a future state, right? So I'm thinking here of aspirational development. I'm thinking of sacred second self. I'm thinking of self one and self two, non-logical identity. This is from Viveki. I won't review that, but just to say that when we say only if we anticipate the very condition that must first be reached. However, the problem of how man is to emerge from barbarism is not yet solved. Neither is that condition established, which alone could impart to the will a direction that would be fair to both opposites, and so unite them. It is truly a sign of the barbarian state that the will is determined unilaterally by one function. For the will must have some content, some aim, and how is this aim set? Okay. Here we can see that the goal, no, not the goal. I want to say that we can see that the situation that we're in, the predicament that we're in, I've defined that in collective terms, in a sense. It's not just the conflict between any opposites, it's the conflict of how humankind is to progress in terms of surviving into the world, right? And so the idea would be that we are still in a state of barbarism, literally like killing each other and like that. And there's going to be descent into chaos and unless we do something about it. And so from that situational awareness, we can see that if the anticipating of the very condition that must first be reached is reliable access to an anti-rivalrous basis of coordination, something like that. So it's I think that will do for the moment. This is, again, in this context, what's relevant is sort of reverse engineering enlightenment, the bodhisattva imperative, enlightenment or bust. We're trying to get to a quote state of higher awareness that can be reliably accessed to serve as a basis for non-rivalrous coordination among humanity, so that we don't blow ourselves off the planet. So that's the condition that we're trying to reach. So this is going to give us at least some sense of a appropriate direction in which the will could be oriented. But importantly, Jung just qualified that. So we can observe about the will, yes, it needs to be directed somewhere. It also comes from somewhere, right? So willing doesn't just emerge randomly or from nowhere. It comes from out of something, and it always has a direction to something. But he also said, it is truly a sign of the barbarian state that the will is determined unilaterally by one function. For the will must have some content, some aim, and how is this aim set? So that's just to say, it's not for my rational thinking to decide the direction of the will, right? The will is contributed to by all the different faculties that we've been naming. We could say it has unconscious and conscious determinants. It's also contributed to by thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition. And then I would want to say, therefore, unconscious counterparts, although I haven't discussed enough of the problem of 7 and 8 to be able to go into that yet. That will come later in the series on dreams. At the moment, it's simply clear to state that the will needs a direction, but that we don't get to decide exactly, we don't get to unilaterally decide what direction that should be. Because Jung says, for the will must have some content, some aim, and how is this aim set? Well, the thing is not just by us, because he says, how else than by an antecedent psychic process? Antecedent meaning before, coming before, which through an intellectual or an emotional judgment or a sensuous desire provides the will with both a content and an aim. Yes, so importantly, as we talked about, it's this not only the holding in creative tension of these different pairs of opposites, but it is their unity, their shared directedness, as in the feelings, the sensations, the intuitions, and the thinking faculties all provide elements of the content and aim of the will. So where one of them doesn't get to take over, we can also see there, I think that this again, this living symbol, this mediating process, this it has propositional, i.e. thinking, procedural, as in skill-based, perspectival, requiring and generating presence, and attunement or participatory elements. These are all also present, I want to say. But I won't expand off into that. I just mention that as an aside, okay? Yeah, so we can see that, again, the dichotomies, the pairs of opposites that are held in creative tension, tonos, they have to contribute to the process by offering different components or aspects of where the will should be directed, and also receiving content, as in it's something to sense, perceive, intuit, and think at the same time. However, this was their positive contribution. each of the negative contributions of these different faculties, again, which have to do with any of the pairs of opposites that are named. We also have to be able to disidentify with them. So this is there's a key skill there. It's a key capacity where we have these different faculties online. We can talk in terms of creative and receptive. We can talk in terms of introversion and extroversion. We can talk in terms of, good and evil or whatever else, thinking and feeling. And we can sort of play in those dichotomies and actually facultatively play in those dichotomies. I'll give you a quick example of I'm thinking of jealousy here. I'm just looking up whatever the opposite of jealousy might be. Compersion. Yeah, a feeling of joy or happiness when a loved one experiences joy. Yeah, particularly in the context of another romantic or sexual relationship. Positive emotion experience when one's partner is happy with someone else. Yeah, so compersion and jealousy, meaning can we use our jealousy as a sensory faculty? Can we inhabit our jealousy but not be reduced to it, right? Is it a language that we have facility with? Okay. And the internal capacity, the internal spaciousness that allows us to hold these inner pairs of opposites means that many of them can be turned on. It's a kind of that's the wheel. There's a forging, churning quality where we use this pair of opposites, and then we use this pair of opposites, and then we use this pair of opposites, and they sort of crisscross over in the sense of Tao 18, if you'd like to look that up, to get. So that's parallax, where if we can use the polarity in the same way that if we can think, feel, sense, and intuit towards something, it's more likely to be real, right? In the same way that if we can see, hear, smell, touch, and taste something, it's more likely to be real. That's parallax, right? In the same way, if we can play in terms of the opposites of yang and yin, or creative and receptive, or good and evil, then these are all new dimensions of creative tension that can expose us to the beginnings of the mediating process coming into conscious awareness. Okay. Okay, so we've observed already that the will is important here, and that it's contributed to but not reduced to, contributed to but not reduced by, sorry, contributed to by but not reduced to any of the different faculties or pairs of opposites that we have named. And therefore, the will, and again, will is here connected with the free will and internal spaciousness to hold these creative tensions. Jung says, in any event, the will is determined more from this side or that, so long as it depends for its content on one side or the other. So then Jung is here clarifying what is the proper ground of the will. And he says, but to be really able to settle the conflict, the will, must be grounded on an intermediate state or process, which shall give it a content that is neither too near nor too far from either side. Okay, so we can see that here we're approaching an understanding of what is the proper ground for the will. Because if the will is grounded in too much rationality, or too much irrationality, too much thinking or feeling, too much of any polarity, meaning actually any definable quality. This is the reason for the importance of the will being free, although freedom is also a definable quality, right? So the will would be equally needing to be trapped or determined by. But the reason, what I mean by free, I'm using free metaphorically just for a moment. What I mean by free is that the proper basis of the will is that it's not based in any definable quality. So the proper basis for the will is the mediating process, the essence of life, the eternal mystery, the living symbol about which we're speaking. Okay. which shall give it a content that is neither too near nor too far from either side, within which each side can participate in. Okay. Jung says, according to Schiller, this must be a symbolic content, since the mediating position between the opposites can be reached only by the symbol. So the idea here is that when the free will is grounded on an intermediate state or process, is given a content. The will is given a content. When we say grounded, I mean directed to. And then there's also, so this is a orienting toward, and then there's also a coming from back into the will, and that's the content, right? And so the content is, according to Schiller, symbolic, since Jung says the mediating position between the opposites can be reached only by the symbol. So symbols have a unique property. They have a way of reaching. So imagine that you're climbing a difficult mountain, and it requires some climbing equipment, right? Some tools like a pick or something like that. I don't know. I'm not a mountain climber. At least in the physical plane. I mean, I'm clearly climbing a mountain right now. Can you tell? Anyway, sorry, that was an aside. So to say, it really needs that tool if you want to climb a certain mountain. If you don't have that tool, then you can't. So we're saying here, we're revealing that symbols have a function that is just like that, where this mediating position can be reached only by the symbol. So there are unique affordances which are attributable to quote symbolic language, and it's not just. That's a creative use of symbol, right? But we're also talking about receiving symbols. Okay. Why is that quality true of symbols? He says, this dual character of real and unreal, it is inherent in the symbol. What he means by this is that these different faculties about which we've been speaking, the reason he's focusing on the faculties as examples of these pairs of opposites is because they're deeply internal to our psychic structure, right? And we tend to identify with one or other of these faculties. We tend to be in this inner split condition. And this is important because these faculties that are the sense-making apparatus by means of which we try to make sense of the world. And so it's very important to understand that these different instincts, for example, like sensing, feeling, thinking, and intuiting, they have different senses of reality. We can also see from John here that propositions, procedures, perspectives, and participation, there are different ways of connecting with reality, meaning truth, power, presence, and attunement. So I want to say that symbols have elements. Yes. So we can see here what I mean to say there is that from the point of view of, let's use the functions for the sake of simplicity, the sense of realness that goes along with thinking, the sense of feeling would regard what is regarded as real by thinking as unreal. So there's a kind of oppositionality, but like what thinking regards as real, feeling would regard as unreal. And what feeling would regard as real, thinking would regard as unreal. Right? In the same way, we can see that we can apply that also to sensation and perception, but we can also apply that to the four ways of knowing as per John, where truth, power, presence, and attunement seem disparate. They seem disconnected, and but they have a convergence on a sense of reality. And for the reason that that's important is because the sense that something is real, or the sense that something is not real, or imaginary, fantastic, is itself another one of those dichotomies. And that's the thing, the very notion that we have of reality, right? That we have a term called reality implies non-reality, implies that there can be non-reality. And that is itself, that is a pair of opposites, which we would need to develop the facility or capacity to disidentify from. Because the effect of it would be that if we were going toward clarifying what is real, that we then get put in the position of what is unreal or imaginary. Yes, as in when reality is defined as such, then the quality of unreality is made more unconscious and internalized in a way which is not so we get hollowed out from within, I would like to say. We relate to ourselves as if we're imaginary, as if we're not real. And I would say that's part of the symptomatology of the meaning crisis. I could refer here to Peter Kingsley in the Pre-Socratics. When we have this orientation toward getting at what is real, again, this is so I'm arguing here for, as I said, the will to symbolism and symbol as vector pathway to the divine. This is a completely different normativity. I'm saying, yes, I'm not wanting to orient us toward what is real. I'm wanting to orient us toward what is between real and unreal, what participates equally in both, so that we don't get trapped in that dichotomy still. Again, the point is any definable term, by simply being a definable term, implies an opposite. We can look at Gödel's incompleteness theorem, and there's, I would say, oodles of philosophy that justifies that point of view. I would say that speech, qua speech, I can maybe defend this in other places by talking more about mind, which comes up later in chapter 5 in Nous. What I mean is this our tendency to name things splits them inherently. And what we're doing is compensating by developing the quality of speaking and naming that can reunify, bring things back together. But the thing is that we have to be able to unify or bring back together all of language. All of language. And this is why I'm so intense about it, is because of the scope and the scale of this project and what's underneath it, right? It's not just it's a completely it's a big shift, right? So we're not just orienting towards what reality, we're orienting toward what can participate equally in reality and non-reality, with the understanding that there is different pros and cons from both. Otherwise, like for example, we can simply see on evolutionary logic that if we were so connected with non-reality all the time, then we would have been selected out of the population long ago, right? So again, there's a distinction there between Newton and Newtonian physics and physics and biology, really, where I'm saying that what we can then see is that the ground is not reality, not what is real, but what matters most, in this world. So in the sense of maps of meaning. So yes, there's a regrounding on, but the thing is that's a trap for myself, because also absurdity, also meaninglessness, also nihilism. Again, the thing is that when we go through reading all these texts, we tend to identify with some of the words, some of the thinkers, some of the positions, right? It's not about that. It's about rediscovering, reinventio, a completely new form of new use of this thing that I'm doing, which we call language, we call speaking. It's an unfinished project, and we think we know what it means. I'm just thinking, can't I apply this logic to symbols or non-symbols? But I think everything is symbolic. There's a way that symbols hold everything within themselves. Anyway, I won't go into that now. We're going to keep going. Again, we're clarifying here that we've clarified, finally, that this intermediate state or process is able to allow these pairs of opposites held in creative tension to be grounded within it, because it has symbolic content. This position between can only be reached by the symbol. Okay. Yeah, because the dual character of real and unreal is inherent in the symbol. If it were only real, it would not be a symbol, for it would then be a real phenomena and hence unsymbolic. So there's a way that, what that implies is that the orientation toward reality as a normative standard is a form of fundamentalism or literalism. That to me smacks of autism, as in we got to, there was a descent from the Pythagorean mystery schools to the Platonic Academy, I'm so arguing, and or mm, or at least to Aristotle. I don't know. I think I'm wanting to say here that um, yeah, symbols connect us more deeply with, it's not reality. That's the thing. It's what is between real and non-real. Symbols connect us more deeply with life, and life may be more important than reality. Or if reality isn't grounded in life, I don't know what reality is. And I can understand that that might seem like that many people would get stuck there, I think. But the thing is that reality is a concept that I learned at some point during my life. Is that not the same for you? And then it could say, yes, yes, but the reality had to exist before I was born. That's an idea because you weren't around at that time. I'm going to move on to say that there's clearly a focus on the importance of symbols as um, the only thing able to really hold the mediating position, to be in the mediating position. Okay, pausing. Importantly here, Jung clarifies that, and this is partly with reference to chapter 3, that um, he thinks of thinking and feeling as rational functions, and sensation and intuition as having a more aesthetic or irrational function. And this is connected with extroversion and introversion in the sense that he argues that sensation and intuition are more aesthetic in the sense that they have more of a focus on the object by which we're connecting here. There's a lack of participation from the point of view of sensing and intuiting, according to Jung. So there's a kind of over focus on the object, and the reason that that's important is because it means that those more sensuous functions against sensation and intuition, the more irrational functions, they're not fitted to create symbols because they're the products of those functions are determined unilaterally by the object. So again, the idea here is that sensation and intuition are more determined by the object. Contain only themselves and not their opposites. Yeah, so again, where the object, where one can see an object in a situation where one can see an object, one's sensation and intuition are determined by that object, and therefore the sensing and intuiting are more deeper to the subject, right? Whereas in the other way around would be that the more rational functions Jung thinks about as thinking and feeling, which are in this context, I think, more um, more determined by the subject. Yeah. Yep, more determined by the subject. Um, and so where one is a subject, one can determine from out of uh, thinking and feeling, but they're unfit to create symbols because they produce only rationalities. Namely, if one is a subject, then one is producing an object, which is kind of too rational in a sense, right? Um, So the important thing here is that each of these faculties, for example, Jung has put thinking and feeling together with rationality, and I would say Apollonian rationalism, thinking and feeling. He says, and I quote, "The rational functions are, by their very nature, incapable of creating symbols, since they produce only rationalities, whose meaning is determined unilaterally." And does not at the same time embrace its opposite. That implies that think about the inadequacy of the rational functions, thinking and feeling, is that they produce only rationalities whose meaning is determined unilaterally. So it's too much top down, it's too much universal meaning, right? There's not enough granularity, not enough particularization, which would be the opposite that they cannot embrace, apparently. So it would be a tendency to think and feel the same thing, and not enough difference. And the alternative is that he says of the other two, which are more irrational functions connected, and here the sensation and intuition connected with the Dionysian, so Dionysian irrationalism rather than Apollonian rationalism. Jung says the sensuous functions, as in sensation and intuition, are equally unfitted to create symbols because their products are determined, their products too are determined unilaterally by the object and contain only themselves and not their opposites. So we can see there that in this, when we talk about this irrational functions, we talked about the aesthetic quality and how aesthetic involves a non-participation. It's a separation from and relating to an object out there somewhere. This is kind of Nietzsche's mistake, let's say. This means that when there's a relating to an object which is out there, that object then has the power of determining the subject. Namely, there's a one is affected in one's sensing and intuiting, which are too deeply personal, so it contain only themselves and not their opposites. So we can see here that sensing and intuiting may be too personal, or may contribute too individual or particularized aspects to be really joined in with this symbolic process. Or we could say that if we need more granularity, if we need more particularity, if we need more personal, then relying on the faculties of sensation and intuition can help us get there. Whereas by contrast, thinking and feeling have a tendency toward sameness, have a tendency toward unity that has complementary strengths and weaknesses. What Jung says is that those four, again, thinking and feeling, sensing and intuiting, are all inadequate for creating symbols because they all can't contain their opposites in the dimensions that I've just named. I think we can see how they all contribute. Obviously, we need them to. But Jung then says, to discover, therefore, that impartial basis for the will, we must appeal to another authority, where the opposites are not yet clearly separated, but still preserve their original unity. Okay, so we can see here again that none of these faculties are sufficient. And we need an impartial basis for the will. It has to be impartial, right? And he, I would say, makes the pre-trans fallacy. It's not that the opposites are not yet clearly separated. It's that they need to be able to be reunified. But I'm not going to go into that here. We're simply going to move on again because I'm trying to get through this. Yep, he goes on. Yes, importantly for Jung, that we already have this orientation toward needing to reunify opposites. We're trying to heal a split. We're trying to mend, repair, again, in the sense of the sets of values that I named in the last episode. Jung makes the connection between consciousness and discrimination. distinguishing ego from non-ego. And so I don't want to actually talk about the word consciousness. I want to talk about conscious and unconscious because I want to be able to use Jung's terms without getting too hung up in them. Okay. And so imagine that we are, because there is a sort of primordial, quote, consciousness that I would say contains conscious and unconscious elements within it. And when talking about the differences between these conscious and unconscious elements within non-dual consciousness, let's say, I would agree with Jung in saying that the conscious side of the personality has more of a facility for discrimination, for splitting into multiple rather than rejoining into many. I don't know if I think there is truth to that. I think there's also the question that we saw how the instincts can be divisive. That was on page 110. And by instincts, we mean here thinking, feeling, sensing, and intuiting. They too can be dividing, right? So I would say that consciousness, sorry, the conscious half of the personality and the unconscious half of the personality, I think each of them can contribute to discriminating into many or synthesizing or integrating into a unity or a whole. But it may be true to say with Jung that the conscious half tends more toward discriminating, which we see in our dichotomizing using our conscious language, and that the unconscious tends more towards reunifying and bringing things back. Again, where it's sort of connected with bringing the problem space up into working memory so that we can actively work on it. Where when it's solved, it sort of sinks back down into conscious unity in the sense of use it or lose it. Things are forgotten when they sink back into the unity of the unconscious, whereas they come up into the multiplicity of consciousness, the conscious half, sorry. Okay. The thing here is that if we define conscious and unconscious, conscious and unconscious, then this is a dichotomizing. This is a split between the two, right? And so I think I think it's fair to say here that we notice a couple of things. We have some awareness, but we also have a sense that there could be more awareness, or that there's some awareness that we're not present to, that we see in, let's say, quote, enlightened beings like Christ and the Buddha and so on, and that we could, if we could access a bit more of their sage-like qualities, that this would be a good thing, and a wise sort of sense of aspirational development like that. We also notice that there is very much a split into manyness in the sense of the fall and the split and the whole dichotomizing into two, right? So we can see that there is a connection between our present awareness, right, and the split into many. And so we can see there that for example, the how does that connect with the will? Actually, I don't need to connect it with the will. I just need to say that there's a space of awareness, the conscious half, there's a space of awareness into which this perception of the many split things has come and continues to come. But there's also I would say, for me, a deep intuition or a deep understanding that there is an impartial basis for that will, for that conscious space of awareness that tends toward discrimination and multiplicity, and that we're wanting to appeal to that. So it's not exactly that we're appealing to the unconscious, because being careful, really careful, trying not to recapitulate the split between conscious and unconscious, right? We're trying to refer to when we say I want to use the word consciousness itself. I want to hold sort of non-dual consciousness as the one which is beyond one and many, and then talk about conscious and unconscious within that. I think by that category that I just named consciousness, which includes everything, that Jung means the unconscious. And I'm gonna apart from Jung there. The reason that that's important is because the word consciousness, the thing is, again, for it to be defined as such, it necessarily implies an opposite, which we could call unconsciousness. So there's not really a way to, I think I'm talking about non-dual awareness, and the whole point of that is that it can't really be defined by definition. So I'm going to use the term consciousness with the understanding that I'm trying to refer to, let's say, non-dual awareness. Even that is just a metaphor. That's the thing. I think all language is metaphor. But the point is, we're appealing to another authority, an impartial basis of the will, in which the opposites can be reunified. And I think it may well be fair to say that we can talk about non-dual awareness in connection with Brahman Atman and these Eastern models that can also serve as a bridge to the Jungian self. So Jung talks about the self in terms of the Brahman Atman, and we can talk about non-duality or Vedanta and Taoism in terms of Atman and Brahman, roughly speaking, and that's what we're going to actually get toward in chapter 5. So we can see here that it's not that so in Jungian terms, this would be, it's not that we're appealing to the unconscious, it's that we're appealing to the dual within the unconscious, which Jung thinks of as the self. It's the yes, and it's the reason for this is because I've got a couple of things here. So the idea is from one becomes two, two becomes three. From out of the third comes the one as the fourth. And so that should actually be the second step. So just hold that in mind. And so to say, we want to in some way take up the position, the willing position of the third, and direct that third towards an impartial basis or authority, where the willing position sort of is indicated by the masculine humbling itself into an aperture, right? Lowering itself before the feminine, before the creative divine matrix of the unconscious, of the body, of non-being, everything in that symbolic category connected with four. And another way of talking about that attitude, that relation between 3 and 4 that I just named, is, again, this is in the introverted condition when the conflict is still present and we're trying to feel toward that conflict, where one takes up the perspective of one's soul. So the masculine, by humbling itself into the depths of our humanity, can take up the depths of one's soul, meaning inhabit what is lowest about one, and from out of that perspective, relate with or commune with for me, it would be, I'll give myself as an example. So it would be that I have this masculine will, which can humble itself by lowering myself into my humanity, into my humility, by taking up the perspective of my soul, which for me has a feminine quality, and then relating to, quote, the unconscious as masculine, right? So there's a masculine. So at that point, it's relating from out of the feminine soul to the masculine unconscious in this case, where as a result of the communion between soul and unconscious, Maya gives birth to the Buddha, or Pandora gives birth to the jewel, or there's an egg, something is born, right? And something that which is born is at first a symbol. And the thing is that then, so Jung talks about that as the, again, relationship between soul and God, or soul and unconscious, that produces the symbol of the self, and that then that self then comes back up through the third, as in it then comes from out of an introverted condition into an extroverted condition by being articulated, or for Jung, by being expressed creatively in terms of mandalas, when he realized that the living significance of the symbol of the self. Yes, we can see there that it's the unconscious as the medium of creative fantasy certainly contributes, but that what is contributed, namely the symbol, and then the revelation of that symbol, is a new center of non-dual consciousness, let's say. It's the jewel that comes out of the unconscious, right? That's the pearl, that's the sword, that's the philosopher's stone, that's the Holy Grail. And about that takes us back to the quote, one becomes two, two becomes three, from out of the third. This is when, from out of the third, meaning when it has been successfully realized symbolically in the introverted condition, it can then be spoken. So again, this is the thing, is that it has to be a process that mediates introversion and extroversion as well. And this is one of the mistakes that Jung made, right? So what we're talking about here in Jung's distinction is in the introverted condition, meaning within oneself, within one's own process, an internal symbol is produced, which can then be creatively expressed into the world, into the extroverted condition, right? If this were one process, then it would be in togetherness, meaning there would be interpersonal activity, but it would also be a deeply intrapsychic process, meaning that it would be a deeply symbolically internally activating process that would result in the inner quote production of a symbol of the self, a symbol as a new center of life, which is also in the same process able to be expressed, and there, so to say, from the third, meaning from the logos, comes the one as the fourth, where comes the one as the fourth. From the third comes the one as the fourth. I don't quite have that last part nailed down yet, because so that the idea, at least I can see there, that there would be something that is then, so there's an internal awareness of this new living center of the symbol that is then able to be spoken in it's realized introvertedly, intrapsychically, but is able to be extroverted, spoken interpersonally. And again, it's this co-transformation of self and world and subject and object, and its new center of life at its highest intensity. But the thing is, the remaining question is, what is the meaning of comes the one as the fourth? And I would say that has to do with the individuation of the world soul. But that's an intuition, and I will have to leave that and come back. We have a lot more clarity at this point, and taking it slowly is a good thing to do, right? Because I'm being very, very careful, trying to be. I think the whole point is that we don't know what that means because it hasn't happened yet. It's a prophecy to fulfill. Maybe we'll know what that means at the time. in any case, we've been on page 112 and we've been exploring how we've been looking for the impartial basis of the will, and I was clarifying we can see here that we can agree with Jung that it's not just about a conscious decision. He says it would therefore be pointless to call upon consciousness to decide the conflict between the instincts. And what he means by that is that we have this same, again, this conscious awareness that we have where there's a split multiplicity. We're in a barbarian state, right? Um, we don't want to, this is Einstein, it's irrational. So we don't want to appeal to the same level of consciousness to solve the problem. We want to appeal to a higher level, quite higher level of consciousness. Jung thinks about that as the unconscious. Um, I think what we can see there, the structure is doesn't really matter what we call it, although maybe it does, but it's a relating from our lowest to what could be highest. So maybe our lowest actuality to our highest potentiality, something like that. And that is the sort of a conceptualization of the highest potentiality that we can imagine could, I think, serve as the impartial basis for the will. And I think that is it's kind of like the divine feminine. I think it's um the thing is that we get stuck here in the dichotomizing. So as I said that it would fail, right? I said that it wouldn't work. Um, we can see that the will is in the position of three, and the will here is connected with freedom, with spaciousness, with ego determination, um, with self-determination, and it needs to be directed somewhere. And we're trying to clarify to what should it be directed. And I think to what it should be directed, I'm going to add some words to what I think it should be directed. It should be directed toward the body. It should be directed toward one's own being, one's who one actually is. It should be directed toward the unconscious, toward one's higher consciousness. It should be directed toward um, the feminine, toward the void, toward non-being, toward the pluripotency of emptiness, toward shunyata. It should be directed toward aha. Is it it's the distinction between the Great Mother and the Ouroboros. And Neumann can help us to clarify that. That's why it's so tricky. That's why it's so tricky, because the Great Mother and Great Father are trapped within the dichotomizing. I think wherever the third arises, let's take the third as the logos, for example. It has to arise in a context, has to arise in a place. There's the logos it isn't alone. That's interesting. I'll leave it there just to say that I think the third qua third in this context, there's a combination of logos and eros in that. It's this emergent property. Again, where, for example, there's someone speaking and someone listening. Let's imagine that the emergent property is of a dialogue is whatever I'm doing here, which we think about as a combination of logos and eros. But there's the fourth here is like, look at all these things and these bodies and this technology and so this is why I'm talking about directing the will, the logos, toward the speaking toward the different objects. Um, the different, it's the context, it's the place, it's the natural forms. Okay. He says the separation into pairs of opposites is entirely due to conscious differentiation. Only consciousness can recognize the suitable and distinguish it from the unsuitable and worthless. It's whatever we've been overlooking. That's the thing. It's whatever we've been overlooking, which is probably ourselves, I think. It alone can declare one function valuable and the other non-valuable, thus bestowing on one the power of the will while suppressing the claims of the other. Yeah. Oh, that's important. So, according to Jung, consciousness has this power of disposing the will, which is what we were talking about as valuable, right? But it's bestowing the will on one side while suppressing the claims of the other, meaning, yes, if we directed it toward oneself, then we'd be forgetting about the claims of the other, who I would say is trying to be speaking to us the whole time. Anyway, so he says, but where no consciousness exists, where purely unconscious instinctive life still prevails, there is no reflection, no pro et contra, no disunion, nothing but simple happening, self-regulating instinctivity, living proportion. So I think it's appealing to the Ouroboros, appealing to the source of life, appealing to life itself. I think it is a combination of self and other. It's not just self. It's also the condition that we're in to the degree that we're unconscious, right? He says, moreover, it would therefore be pointless to call upon consciousness to decide the conflict. Otherwise, we would have already done it, right? Conscious decision would be quite arbitrary. So it's not something that we decide consciously, according to Jung. A conscious decision would be quite arbitrary and could never supply the will with a symbolic content. That alone can produce an irrational solution of a logical antithesis. So the important point here is that the unconscious is the natural producer of symbols or forms. So it's the basis of those natural forms. A conscious decision would be quite arbitrary and could never supply the will with a symbolic content, which it needs, right? That alone can produce an irrational solution of a logical antithesis. We need the symbolic content, and this is the reason for appealing to the unconscious. For this, we must go deeper. We must descend into the foundations of consciousness. The thing is that it's at the borderline. The foundations of conscious and unconscious felt in the body is close to the source of life. I think it's in the belly, which is connected with the forge, the churning. For this, we must go deeper. We must descend into the foundations of consciousness, which have still preserved their primordial instinctivity, that is, into the unconscious, where all psychic functions are indistinguishably merged in the original and fundamental activity of the psyche. Pausing. Okay, I am going to continue. I took an extended break, and the reason for that is because I needed a break. I don't have to give a reason, but I am going to continue. I was going to record this separately, but I think I want to have this all in one place. And it is long and it is exhaustive, but it is also helpful and easier for someone to follow, I think, in one part. What we've been exploring is the proper basis of the will. And I think the trick here is that when in terms of the problem of 3 and 4, right? So we're talking about from the third comes the one as the fourth. And this is applying this quote to discover the living symbol or mediating function capable of uniting different pairs of opposites. And the trouble with that is that when I characterize the 3 and 4 in terms, such as masculine and feminine, logos and eros, conscious and unconscious, that will do. These are binary oppositions, and we've been connecting with them with the quality of 2, right? Sorry, they're connected with dichotomy and 2-ness. So we want to be able to try and understand or perceive the 3 and 4 and what is meant by them in this context without reference to dichotomy, which is a difficult task. We've connected, and it was originally Jung who did so. The will with what is referred by 3. And this does not reduce the will to consciousness. It says that there are conscious and unconscious aspects of the will. So the way to do this, I think, would be to understand that between any pair of opposites, there is the problem of 3 and 4. And that problem can be taken as an entirety. And one way of talking about that 3 and 4 is in terms of those pairs that I named, conscious and unconscious, masculine and feminine, logos and eros. And when using that way of talking about 3 and 4, we can see that the will, which we've associated with it's important to understand that. Now, hang on, I have to do that more carefully. What I have to say instead. Trying to identify qualities associated with the third that don't reduce it into dichotomies, and qualities associated with the fourth that don't reduce it into dichotomies. And so when we're talking about this third, this is why we've been talking about the will. It's also connected with an emergent property, so synthesis rather than thesis or antithesis. It's connected with, for me, it clearly is. The thing is that this third, this emergent property of the creative tension between opposites, has elements of logos and eros. It has elements of conscious and unconscious. It has rational and irrational elements. Okay, it's the spaciousness or the freedom within which the dichotomy between these different pairs of opposites arises. And I think this is enough clarity about what is indicated by the third, what we mean by the third. Where the 1 and 2 are relata, the third is the relation. It's the binding between them and around them. It's the will by which they come together and stay together. Yep. So then we can see that the simplest examples are to refer to the phenomenology of what happens in our immediate present experience, right? Where let's imagine that I'm talking to an other. Well, this is a kind of dialogue. It's kind of dichotomizing. There's a 2-ness, self and other, which is present. The idea is that how do we talk about the 3 in this context? Well, the 3 is the expression of language. So imagine a fountain stream or a smoke column of symbols that is rising between us. This is the purpose or the function of the speaking in this context. And so I'm creating it, but it's also being received, right? This is what's meant by logos in this context. But it's also the space within which the two orbit each other. It's a space of understanding. It's a space of regarding the two as two. It's a space of perceiving symbols. It's also a space from which symbols are created, right? It's connected with the will because there is a will to be here, right? There is some choice, some free will, let's say, keeps us listening, or in fact doesn't, guides us to interact, and to adhere within our understanding of the logos, because it's the creative power of these words that binds us and keeps us in some way. That means that the logos and its manifesting has a self-willing quality. Okay, so this is pretty obvious. I'm hoping that it's a little more clear, that one has a better sense for what is meant by the third in this context. And I gave an example or instance of that as manifests now. The question would be that, like, if we can see that there is a clear connection between the logos, the will, freedom, spaciousness, and these qualities of the self-determining, and self-actualizing qualities of the third, then it has to come from out of somewhere and into somewhere. And I think that's us. But it's not just us, it's also, so for example, if we take the logos as it's present here, like if I say that my speaking is participating in the logos, let's, for the sake of argument, then it comes out of somewhere. Namely, it comes out of, I don't know, unintelligibility and into intelligibility. It comes out of my body and into the freedom of space. It comes out of the unconscious creative matrix, and into the conscious receptive forms. Yes, I think it's important there we can see that there is a basis of the will which contributes to that will. So the will comes from out of somewhere. And that from out of somewhere, I think, has there are unconscious and conscious determinants of the creative aspect of the will. And so this is a self-willing into being, which is also a creating. It's a little more poetic kind of language, right? Both my conscious and unconscious are contributing to whatever I'm going to say next. And but then there's also a receiving, right? It's not just a will from out of, it's also a will back into. And so because here there is let's say a Sam that's creating the logos, right? And there are, again, conscious and unconscious sides of the personality that are contributing to that self-willing of the logos of the third, into the freedom of spaciousness. However, the third is also received. It's also a will to somewhere, not just from somewhere, and it's a will to that is to both conscious and unconscious. Again, so where it's received by a listener, for example, then there's a receptive quality, and it's received by both the conscious and unconscious aspects of personality. I think we can see there that when we talk about directing the will, we must understand that both conscious and unconscious direct the will, and both conscious and unconscious receive the products of that creative will. Thus, yes, the thing is that we want to step out of the language again, right? So I tried to indicate using some different words what is meant by the third, which has to do with, again, these different elements that are hard to pin down that hopefully one has a sense of. The third is the emergent property. It's the logos. It's the language that I'm using. It's the combination of logos and eros. It is the freedom of spaciousness. It's the self-willing, self-determining that is between the two, right? But then when we want to distinguish the three from the four, again, it's this distinguishing that's difficult, right? It's that in my description of the three that I just gave, there is a from out of which and then a back into which that is implied in that description, right? And it's not just self, it's not just unconscious, it's not just other, it's not just conscious. But there is something that is, and this is why Jung says, right? He said earlier, if I can find it. Mm, the symbol, the symbol in this context, by which we mean the logos. Look, language is symbolic, right? So I'm speaking. Let's assume for the sake of argument, just for the moment, that language is equivalent to symbol. Presupposes a function that creates symbols, and in addition, a function that understands them. So look, when I'm speaking, I can create language that has meaning, let's say. And in addition, people can receive the language and understand it, and it has meaning. That's kind of a miracle, right? That's kind of as in, speech itself relies on the symbol creating and symbol receiving or symbol understanding functions. And I think it's a little more clear at that point. So because by the fourth, because we're trying to define the fourth as distinct from the third here, and it's difficult to do because we can't really use definition to do it, or distinction, because we can't distinguish the three and four, because then we get stuck back in the two again, right? So I've characterized the three in some terms, but we've also observed that within that description of the three, or implied by that description of the three, there is a from out of which and a back into which is implied in the description. So importantly, there's a performative contradiction which is at risk, where if I were to describe to you these qualities of, like, what is it about this three that we're trying to define or distinguish, right? Then it relies on that very same capacity to perform that function. And this is why we can identify the third, but when we do, the fourth drops out of view. So again, when we become conscious of the third, then the fourth drops into the position of the unconscious. It's kind of that which is easily overlooked, that which is always implied, or that which is always assumed. It's, if we're fish, then what is the water? The water would be the fourth in this context, I think. Yeah, so it's connected with, but not reducible to, terms such as the unconscious, the feminine, the body, the implicit, the void, non-being, the source of life, the source of symbols, the source of language. Undifferentiated unity rather than differentiated multiplicity. Okay. That will do. We can see how what we've done there is characterize one becomes two, two becomes three, and out of the third comes the one as the fourth, by clarifying some of the qualities connected with what is meant by three and four in that quote, without relying too heavily on distinction and terminology. So it's a very tricky experiment that I'm trying to conduct here. So I'm just trying to give a sense of this. Because I'm relying and drawing on this three and four all the time when I'm speaking about it. So that makes it very tricky to refer to, right? Okay, but from there we can see, because we're also trying to discover or notice something that we haven't noticed before, right? So the idea being that the whole time we've been in an unconscious or introverted condition, and that by noticing something that we haven't noticed before, we could reverse engineer enlightenment or bootstrap consciousness to a quite higher condition, to higher state, so as to emerge out of barbarism and return into wholeness, unity, undifferentiation. But it's a betweenness. So the idea would be to produce a living symbol by appropriately clarifying this relationship between 3 and 4. And that's what we're really after here. So I tried to characterize some of the aspects of 3 and 4 as distinct from each other, with some qualifications that was a very tricky thing to do because they're not really distinct. They're going together, right? What we can see from here is that the third, which is connected with the will, again, is it coming from out of and back to? Is it coming from out of and back to the fourth? And importantly, that will, the thing is just that will, I was going to say that will has conscious elements. But importantly, the fourth, which category I have already described just now, also has conscious and unconscious elements. So we as beings participate in and are constituted by this problem of 3 and 4. It structures our being in terms of, again, conscious and unconscious, masculine and feminine, and logos and eros. Now, this means that there's a taking up of both points of view. There's a taking up of the point of view of threeness, the perspective, but also participating in fourness. And what that could look like is taking up the conscious masculine logos, but participating in the unconscious feminine eros. But again, this is traps us in the language because I've just put it into a dichotomy. So if we start talking about that dichotomy, then it distracts us from the truth of what is here. So try not to think about it in terms of the dichotomies that I've named. It indicates they point to, but it's not reduced to them. Okay. This is why it has an irrational basis. So the most important idea for this part is that the will can have a direction, and importantly, we can see there that since we are composed of conscious and unconscious, and we participate in the will, there's unconscious will to unconscious will. Sorry. The will mediates the relationships between conscious and unconscious, where the unconscious relates to itself. This is the psychology of the transference stuff. The unconscious also relates to the conscious half of the personality, but the conscious half of the personality can also relate to the conscious half of the personality, and the conscious half of the personality can also relate to the unconscious, right? And so if we, for the sake of argument, suggest or offer that the unconscious is the unconscious aspect of things, which is more connected with fourness, imagine that has been actually, importantly, the thing is that it is both conscious and unconscious. So we're trying to wake ourselves up here, right? And so the idea is that part of the idea is that it's we who have been sleeping. And when I say it's we who have been sleeping, I mean that we are in the position of the 4. However, we also notice that we have this free will that is at our disposal. Yes, it is at our disposal. We can direct it toward our sleeping selves, our unconscious selves. But the idea, importantly, would also be that the feminine has been like trying to communicate to us the entire time, and it's more clear if I say that the masculine has been trying to communicate to us the whole time, and we have been in the feminine sleeping position. That's more clear. Sorry, I can't believe I didn't clarify that earlier. So importantly, because we are beings that comprise 3 and 4, we can take up masculine and feminine, we can take up conscious and unconscious within us. Because of that, if we identify with any of those sides, then we see things from out of that point of view. So let me be specific and thorough, which is what I like to do. What were we talking about? We were talking about creative and receptive. We were talking about logos and eros, talking about masculine and feminine, and conscious and unconscious. So I'll describe some differences that will help us. So and 3 and 4. Yep. So if we, from the point of view of, if we take up the creative perspective, right, then I'm creating freely these words into the world. I have creative agency over the forms that I produce, right? If I take up the receptive point of view, then I am listening and understanding and receiving the forms which are created or produced. Not just in language, because look here, look around in the room. So literally look around in the room. If I take up the creative perspective, then look, man has made this, right? This is the masculine creator tool making that has created all of these physical objects out of the creative perspective, right? But out of the receptive, if I'm in the receptive, then I can if I'm in the receptive, then I'm not taking the point of view of the creator. I'm taking the point of view of seeing that there are these forms that have been created, right? That are given. And let's not go into thinking and say, oh, it's us that's created them. Just notice them and receive them into awareness. Then it can be clear that they can be received. They're sort of given, and in that they're just there, and that there are forms. We can identify them. Yeah, that's taking up the perspectives of creating the forms and receiving the forms. And implied is creating the forms such that they can be received and receiving the forms that have been created. It's also implied. The next one, let's do conscious and unconscious. So if I take up the conscious point of view, then here I am, we're conscious, we're right here, right? And so we're relating to or talking about this unconscious, which is sort of somewhere else. It's beneath the surface. We're not aware of it. This is taking up the conscious point of view. And look, because we say, we think, look, there is consciousness within within us, right? We are conscious beings, and there's all of this matter. There's all of this that is even our body, right? That is not conscious. It's unconscious. It's not animate. Yeah. So the subject is associated with the conscious, and the object is associated with unconscious. This is kind of Cartesian split. Whereas I also offered that we could take up the perspective of the unconscious and say, hey, if we take up the perspective of the unconscious, that could mean two things. One, it could mean that we self-evaluate as, this conscious awareness is actually unconscious, and we thought it was conscious, but it's only a little bit, and it could be more conscious than we actually are. But it could also mean to literally take up the perspective of that which we see and relate to as unconscious. Okay, and I hope that is clear, where this would be a way to, because if I say, I am in the unconscious, sorry, if I say, I am in the, yes, sorry, I did get that right. I'm just getting tired. If I say, I am in the unconscious, I'm still identifying as the subject with objects which I can regard as conscious, right? Or something like that. Or I can still regard them as unconscious, and then it's unconscious relating with unconscious. Alternatively, if I can take up the perspective of that which I see, the objects which I see are unconscious, then I would start asking questions like in the IFS vein of what is it like to be that tree? What is it like to be the bottle? What is it like to be, et cetera, et cetera? And there's a relating with and attempting to, this is sort of implying panpsychism. Um, there's a little subtle difference where there's more of taking up the identity of the object rather than staying within the subject and simply self-evaluating differently. There's a subtle difference. I'm going to leave that behind. So I've done creative and receptive, conscious and unconscious. I'm now going to do masculine and feminine. And simply for the sake of argument, I'm going to connect that with dominant and submissive because that's probably the most, triggering. It's the most obvious, I think. Also one of the most deeply wired, I think. So, because what I mean is that the origins of masculine and feminine have to do with sex, right? In the sense of asexual life versus sexually reproducing life. What I mean is, so if we take up the masculine point of view, then we exert our controlling, dominating force, or like we manipulate all these inanimate objects, which are in a we use our masculine will and look, this mother nature submits to our instruction because we can do what we want. It's this kind of story. And alternatively, if we take up the point of view of the feminine in this context, and of course I'm not reducing masculinity to dominance and femininity to submissiveness. That's why I said it was most triggering, because it's for the sake of argument. And that will come up because ultimately it is the correct attitude is the inverse. And I will talk about that in a second, but just let me lay this out where if I say, for the sake of argument, if I take up the feminine as the perspective of the feminine as submissive, then I am being this is Schopenhauer's pessimism. This is being moved around by unconscious forces that are being thrown into my life, not having any control. I'm the victim of perpetrators who have pushed me around, and maybe I don't like that, or maybe I do. This is just take up. Yeah, so then if I just invert that for the sake of creating less of a, because we can clearly see that these narratives don't really work, right? So the proper role of I would say the proper role of the masculine is to lower oneself into submissiveness. That's not exactly, again, there are mistakes either side. If I were to do that, what that might look like is that one becomes like a vessel or a yes, one can hold everything within oneself, where the masculine lowers itself. So this is the attitude of humility, an attitude of wondrous amazement at, look, all these forms which are so beautiful and so miraculous, are they not? And there is a yes, there is allowing oneself as masculine to be impressed by reality, by the externals, let's say, by, we could say, the feminine or the unconscious. Alternatively, if we want to take up the if we take up the feminine dominant, then that's probably the one that I'm most disconnected from, which is why it's tricky. Let me see how I can get it. Where did it go? It's like this. It's the, I think it's the soul speaking up. It's me like revealing more of my emotions. It's being more explicit or more provocative. I certainly have been doing that, right? Um, or I don't know if that's true to say. Yeah, it's a sort of it's connected with the Kali quality, I think. So we could say externally that looks like metacrisis, does it not? It's like the Mother Nature gets pissed off. She's not exactly lying there inert, waiting for us to rescue her. She's going to kick us off the planet. Um, they're very like I'm it's really not exaggerating. That's like we're going to get booted off, friends. Um, introcyclically, that looks like anima possession, where that's back to the stuff about Prometheus and Pandora, where one has a subservient relationship with one soul who essentially stomps all over the ego personality. And Jung was saying, like, no, you have to be on equal terms with the soul so that it's allowed space to express itself from in that role or whatever she wants, essentially. Um, and again, we can see this holding open creative tension there as well, where if we, in Jungian terms, develop a relationship with our soul, well, maybe sometimes she wants to be in a more creative mood, and sometimes she's in a more receptive mood. And similarly with ourselves, as let's say with ourselves, the ego or persona as masculine, just for the sake of it's just my example. There can be times of wanting to receive and take in, and times of wanting to create and share. Yep. And then the only other pair was 3 and 4, where hmm, if I the point of view of the 3 is kind of like the imagine that the logos itself has a perspective. Imagine that it's the Geist, it's the we space, it's the shared presence, it's the awareness which is binding us together, right? Like that. But if we take up this is connected with 3 quality, right? But if it's connect it's taking up the perspective of the 3. But there's something here where with if we're trying to take up the perspective of no, it's like if the 4 isn't something that we take up the perspective of, it's something that we participate in. Uh, does that make sense? Perspectival being 3 and participatory being 4, where the 4 is more connected with look, where do these words come out of and where do they go back to? It's participating in life. It's the source of life. It's a noticing of life itself. And this is why Schopenhauer um, wrote so much about life. But the reason he developed this pessimism is because it doesn't seem directed or toward anything. And Jung's whole contribution was like, no, man, there's archetypal forces that are going on there. It has a direction. It has a goal, in fact. Okay, that might have given us a little bit more clarity about this 3 and 4 business. And what I want to say is that all of that, we can see how there's a kind of cycle that can be implied by those different perspectives, where there's a kind of taking up each of them in sequence. That I can't. There's something there that I can't yet articulate, but I will get there, but not today. Where, mm, so it's like because Jung's talking about again, it's the question of the right attitude and the right disposition, the right basis for the will. So the idea would be to um, inhabiting the perspective of the will to humble ourselves before Mother Nature, so fall to our knees before Kali and honor her and beg her forgiveness and please don't kick us off the planet, right? And but this would also contribute creative logos to the seemingly unconscious forms, which could bring them to life, bring them to animacy. And this would be a version of from the third comes the one as the fourth. So this is bringing the fourth into consciousness. From the other point of view, it would be that we are that fourth that is spoken to. And the thing is that we can be both. So where it would be, well, what if we're in the position of the fourth, which is unconscious and being spoken to, if we are those natural forms, what exactly are we infused by? We're infused by the logos. We're infused by our higher selves. Everything that's represented by three. From out of the third comes the one as the fourth. There's a quality of it would bring us back to life. It would bring us back to life. In this, that's in the sense of zombies, in the sense that we've been zombies. We've been zombies this whole time. This is Frankenstein. Frankenstein, bring us back to life. There's a reason that that's a horror story, right? It's something edgy about the whole process. Okay. So I've hoped to clarify a little bit of the difficulty with this 3 and 4 problem, because we can inhabit all of those perspectives and participate at all of those levels, which means that we can't define this 3 and 4 in terms of these dichotomies, because they all apply to each, and those different perspectives and participations, modes of participation, could say, are all important and critically important. That's why. But now, if we follow Jung, we can see that there is a rising up, which is an emerging, and an emanating down. And Jung calls that rising up from the unconscious and emanating down from the conscious, right? The connection here is that this rising up occurs in the introverted condition, and the emanating down occurs more in the extroverted condition. I would say. The thing is, it's this process which is both at the same time. This is a reason for getting back toward the symbols, because we have to recognize that all of our words, all of our speaking isn't getting us anywhere. So we have to humble ourselves before the humble foundations of our sense-making architecture, like again, the deepest sense-making structures that are available to mankind, the use of symbolic language. So Jung says, it would be pointless to call upon consciousness to decide the conflict between the instincts. A conscious decision would be quite arbitrary and could never supply the will with a symbolic content that alone can produce an irrational solution of a logical antithesis. For this, we must go deeper. We must descend into the foundations of consciousness, which have still preserved their primordial instinctivity. That is, into the unconscious. The thing is that Jung ends up he actually sort of ends up going into the unconscious. And I was talking more about how to dispose the conscious will, which he says is pointless. It's a risky process, right? And we don't want to go too far in the wrong direction. So let's try and get some clarity here. Jung says, the reason for going back down to the depths is because that's where all these different psychic functions have still preserved their primordial instinctivity, where all psychic functions are indistinguishably merged in the original and fundamental activity of the psyche. And so, again, we're trying to get away from this quality of like too much differentiation, too much particularity, too much manyness, too much splitting of the instincts, back towards unity. And the idea would be that somewhere at the ground of our being, close to the unconscious, is this unity. So Jung talks about a lack of differentiation in the unconscious, where there would be a split quality in the conscious half. The thing is that I think Jung went too far into the introversion. We're too far, like literally going into this deep intrapsychic process And I regard that as sort of somewhat neurotic, where this is why I've focused on this borderline quality of like, if we go toward the symbols, understanding that they have rational and irrational elements, then this is a quality of like focusing on the borderline or on the mirror, on the glass between, rather than going too far, to quote the other side, rather than going into the other side. And I will have more to say about that when we get to, in the dream series, the myth or archetype of the mirror. But I'm not going to say more about it here, but just to say that I'm not completely agreeing with Jung that it's descent into the unconscious that we ought to pursue exactly. But we can agree with him that as we get closer to the borderline between conscious and unconscious, there is things resolve into unity. Like the symbols offer a kind of convergence within themselves. So the symbols that arise from the source of life, symbols that arise from the ground of the psyche, they have a unifying, reunifying function. Um, yep. So importantly, Jung makes the mistake of identifying the unconscious as the authority that we need to appeal to. Where I've said instead that the authority to appeal to is to humble the will in the position of the three toward everything that is represented by fourness, which is not exactly the unconscious. The unconscious captures part of it, but it's also connected with our unconscious identity as who's here. It's also connected with the body. It's connected with the natural world. It's more than just the unconscious. It does have consciousness. We don't want to get trapped into this conscious and unconscious distinction. He says, quote, the unconscious then might well be the authority we have to appeal to. But there's a question about it. He's wondering, right? Since it is a neutral region of the psyche, where everything that is divided and antagonistic in consciousness flows together into groupings and configurations. But to me, this could also mean that what I mean is that we are in our being, we are the neutral region of the psyche, where the psyche is taken as the whole of existence. So, right, imagine that there is conflict between the gods who are high up in heaven, right, somewhere. They're in divided and antagonistic, and beneath us in the unconscious, there's this amorphous mass of undifferentiated unity. Well, we in between are this neutral region of the psyche, where, quote, everything that is divided and antagonistic, and also I would say everything that is unified and undifferentiated flows together into groupings and configurations, meaning has this optimal balance of form and essence, logos and eros, flow and particularity. So if we imagine that we are that, so I'm saying that in a sense, we are the authority that we have to appeal to. Since we are the neutral region of the psyche, where everything that's divided and antagonistic in consciousness flows together into groupings and configurations. But the thing is that it's not just getting sucked into self-reflective narcissism, because that would be a mistake. That would be literally Narcissus. He'd get stuck there. There's also an orientation to the earth, to service, right? To going out and among. But where we are, it's the thing is that it's we and the world. We are the neutral region of the psyche, because we are an emergent property of relationship between self and world, where everything that's divided and antagonistic in consciousness flows together into groupings and configurations. I think we can then also identify that the place, the neutral region of the psyche where everything that's divided and antagonistic flows together into groupings and configurations, is those symbols, right? And so we are in fact divided and antagonistic manifestly, are we not? And so it's about getting back down to the depths. So there's a yes, it's us, but it's not just us. It's on the borderline. And so it's these symbolic contents, these that Jung says, these, when raised to the light of consciousness, reveal a nature that exhibits the constituents of one side as much as the other. They nevertheless belong to neither, these constituents, but occupy an independent middle position. Sorry, it's the symbols. The symbols don't belong to anyone. They're just there. They occupy an independent middle position. It is this position that constitutes both their value and their non-value for consciousness. Yes, they are worthless insofar as nothing clearly distinguishable can be perceived. Nothing clearly distinguishable can be perceived from their configuration, thus leaving consciousness embarrassed and perplexed, but valuable insofar as it's just their undifferentiated state that gives them that symbolic character, which is essential to the content of the mediating will. That's an important passage to unpack there, where these symbols, right, they have this quality of mediating. And Jung is talking about how some of these aspects of this mediation arise mutually. And so these symbols, they're both valued beyond, they're both of infinite value and worthless. And he says that they're worthless insofar as, quote, nothing clearly distinguishable. I could say nothing which is clearly distinguishable, as in we can see nothing clearly from their configuration, from their form. So their form, the form of these symbols, implies emptiness, which makes them worthless in some sense, which makes them empty, thus leaving consciousness embarrassed and perplexed. They seem worthless. This is why we can't understand Zen, right? To the degree that we can't. But they're also valuable insofar as it's just their undifferentiated state. Their undifferentiated state that gives them that symbolic character. Which is essential. So it's kind of like it's when we see their form, it implies the emptiness which we regard as worthless. But when they stay on the borderline and we notice that they have an undifferentiated state, that gives them this symbolic character as well, which is essential to the content of the mediating will. So it's this quality of being on the borderline. Again, we've been diagnosing this problem of 3 and 4 in terms of really mostly conscious and unconscious. And I will keep going here. On page 113. And we're talking about, again, we're trying to reinvent here this process of mediating between any pair of opposites. And we're talking about the problem of 3 and 4 in connection with that. And we're talking about its basis in symbols and getting clear about their power. And so Jung says, the thing is that we are living symbols. That's the thing. And that we participate and co-create more symbols. We are like a babushka of symbols. Jung says, thus, besides the will, which is entirely dependent on its content, man has a further auxiliary in the unconscious. that maternal womb of creative fantasy, which is able at any time to fashion symbols in the natural process of elementary psychic activity. I think I want to say the thing there is that these symbols spontaneously arise, and it's the spontaneously arising quality that is important here. It's not something that can be contrived, designed, or created. It's getting in touch with the natural process of elementary psychic activity, with the symbols which can serve to determine the mediating will. So it's where we provide the forms, it's that they can be filled naturally with this essence that comes from beneath. Where there's a three, a masculine three, which is articulated and conscious. This is again if I that would be this. So again, imagine that the three triangles on either corner, they're this masculine three, and it's the conscious, it's the will, it's the logos, it's the form. And look, within that form, there is emptiness. There is emptiness. So that they're a hollow quality, which is what Jung means when they say entirely dependent on its content. They have an inner emptiness. They need to be filled, revivified with forms. And then if I say, well, where from? From the maternal womb of creative fantasy, which is able at any time to fashion symbols in the natural process. So imagine that within the unconscious, there's this kind of structure where it's mostly dark and dangerous, and there's mostly the shadow and the negative feminine and the negative masculine and all kinds of horrible, the opposites of whatever is implied consciously. But there's one redeeming, positive content, which is bursting toward the surface. So there's a kind of 3 and 1, 1 and 3 quality. And I will go more into that when I talk about the structure more in dreams. But I want to stop there for the moment with that and say it's the symbols which serve to determine the mediating will. And he says, I say can advisedly because the symbol does not of its own accord step into the breach, but it remains in the unconscious. Just so long as the energetic value of the conscious contents exceeds that of the unconscious symbol. What does he mean by this? Well, it's like he's saying that the material that goes through our consciousness as distinct from our unconscious, it has an energetic value. Like, so there's energy which is available to us in the dichotomies and distinctions that we've been talking about. And that means that the symbol is not infused with energy. So what we're talking about is implicit symbols, which are sort of lying dormant within the unconscious and indeed within reality, beneath the conscious layer of self and world, in the unconscious layer of self and world, and that they don't step into this edge of conscious awareness so long as our conscious contents are okay and we can keep talking with whatever we're using. He says, under normal conditions, this is always the case. But under abnormal conditions, a reversal of value sets in, whereby the unconscious acquires a higher value than the conscious. What does he mean by this? Well, it's kind of a strange or unusual condition. That might be a strange situation. It might be a strange moment. It might be, a psychedelic experience, a transformative conversation. It might be, look, an awareness of the whole situation, and if there can be a recognition that we are actually under abnormal conditions. The thing here is that The tricky realization here would be, if I'm right, that he's sort of saying that he's implying that we've been in introversion for the entirety of human history in a way, then there's a way that we've also been under abnormal conditions that entire time. In which case, like I'm talking about a kind of inversion here. And what I mean by that is that if we've been under abnormal conditions the entire time, well, in that situation, the unconscious acquires a higher value than the conscious. And so this is where we talk about this again, these symbols as a kind of emerging center of consciousness, right? Well, imagine that we've actually been unconscious this whole time. Imagine that it would be possible to take up the point of view of a emerging center of conscious awareness. That would be a kind of reversal of value, but it would be in fact a reversal into normal conditions, which would look abnormal to us because we've been in abnormal the whole time. But imagine that it were actually a step into normal conditions where consciousness acquires a higher value than what is unconscious, where we have been unconscious and we can step into more consciousness. It says, hmm, that gets a little tricky. So I want to leave that behind and then talk about the sort of standard version of interpreting this, which would be that we're under normal conditions now, and that we're able to talk with each other because because the contents of our conscious have a high energetic value, let's say, and that the implicit symbolic structures, let's say, that are lying dormant at the surface of our unconscious, um, they're not activated and brought to the surface because we're not under abnormal conditions. And so if we were to enter an abnormal situation, according to Jung, and I have experienced moments like this, what happens is that a reversal of values sets in where the unconscious acquires a higher value than the conscious. And at that time, the symbol then rises to the surface without, however, being taken up by the will and the executive conscious functions. Since these, on account of the reversal of value, have now become subliminal. So what we can see there is that there's a quality there of emergence from the depths. So imagine that we've been mostly in normal conditions, and that we step into abnormal conditions, and that implies a reversal of value. What does a reversal of value mean? It means that these symbolic contents rise up and assume a higher value, and that that it doesn't appear to be from our will. They're not taken up by the will. Because yes, the thing is that there's a danger element here. So Jung is describing where under abnormal conditions, where the symbols rise to the surface without being taken up by the will. Since these, on account of the reversal of value, have become subliminal, where the unconscious has become supraliminal, and an abnormal state, a psychic disturbance, has supervened. This is not necessarily a healthy condition. So the alternative to that would be to, under normal conditions, recognize the imbalance and to willfully, voluntarily, freely, and carefully orient the logos toward the unconscious so that so that the right amount of unconscious material can flow through. safely without too much psychic disturbance. Yeah, there's a kind of if our consciousness is like a dam which has always been blocked up, right? Well, if we just wait and wait and wait, we get sort of overwhelmed when the flood finally comes. But if we can, under normal conditions, correctly dispose our will and humble the will, then it can allow the power of these symbols to flow through from the unconscious that can mediate this split between the opposites. Okay. Jung then says, under normal conditions, therefore, so where we don't want the abnormal condition, we don't want this massive reversal of value, which sounds demiurgic. We don't want psychic disturbance or an abnormal state. We want things to stay chill as much as possible. So under normal conditions, therefore, energy must be artificially supplied, as in supplied by the will, to the unconscious symbol in order to increase its value and bring it to consciousness willingly. And then the question is again, how to do that? And he says, this comes about through a differentiation of the self from the opposites. Again, there's a quality of self-sacrifice here, where there's also an unveiling of the self. It's a taking up of the point of view of the masculine and feminine parents and granting or disposing one's consciousness to that symbol. And where this can be done willingly, it is then differentiated that self from the opposites, from any pair of opposites. And it then becomes something that we participate in and something that participates in us. And it's not a thing. It's a when we can parent it in the sense of a thou, it's a parenting relation. Yes, and this is humbling the will. It's not just humbling the will, it's devoting energy, devoting ourselves toward the differentiation of the self as good parents do. Yes, and importantly, that also involves, as per the footnote here, it says, quote, insofar as individuality embraces our innermost lusts and incomparable uniqueness, it also implies becoming one's own self. The self is our life's goal, for it is the completest expression of that fateful combination we call individuality. So again, it has elements here, this self, it has elements of differentiation into diversity and reunification, integration into unity. And so yeah, the thing is that it's by taking up the perspective of one's soul that one is able to most intimately commune with the differentiating self. And I would need to get a little bit more clear about Jung, about what's the right thing to do from the point of view of the soul, because I think what we're wanting to talk about here is what exactly does the soul relate with? Does it relate with the symbols? But they've already been produced. Does it relate with God? Isn't that who's absent? So the point is that this differentiation of the self is not doesn't turn us into slaves. It enables a self-generated feedback loop where there's a quality of optimization of individuality and collectivity, where we can move deeper into our soulfulness, deeper into our uniqueness, into our diversity, but also deeper into unity, deeper into collectivity. Because the thing is that it's a naturally emergent phenomenon within groups is the idea. And then there would be an optimal balancing of uniqueness as an individuality, but also conformity, collectivity. I'll talk more about that in the context of the psyche as sacrament, because John Dewey talks a great deal about Tillich in this context of individuation and participation. Talks about freedom and destiny, individuation and participation, and potential and actual. But I'm leaving this for now. Yes, we can see here that, yes, we're talking about a process here where under normal conditions, energy is artificially supplied to the unconscious symbol by our free conscious choice in order to bring it to the level of consciousness. We do that by a quality of I thou relating and like parenting this self so that it can differentiate itself from any of the pairs of opposites. But it's not that we just relate to it as a child, because it's also us as the child, right? It's a tricky thing to talk about there because it's in between all the categories. That's why it's the thing is that I'm trying to talk about it, which is why it's so tricky. But importantly, the differentiation of the self from the opposites is just what we were saying earlier. It's this disidentifying from any of the opposites. And as Jung says, this differentiation from the opposites amounts to a detachment of the libido from both sides, insofar as the libido is disposable. Yeah, so the energy, the psychic energy, is freely disposed by the will toward and into the self. It's given. For the libido invested in the instincts is only in part freely disposable, just so far, in fact, as the power of the will extends. Yeah, so Jung really is connecting the will here with the conscious will. We don't have to follow him. We can say that the will has unconscious elements, but it's not that important at this point. But the point is that Jung says this is represented by the amount of energy which is at the free disposal of the ego. Yes, as in the will. Let's say that the will has conscious elements that are at our disposal, right? We don't have to reduce the will to that, but we're saying the amount of will that we do have, where should we devote it to? Well, to this self, through differentiating from the opposites. And this would raise these symbols to the level of conscious awareness. And yes, facilitate this process of remediation between pairs of opposites. And what that looks like is from the third comes the one as the fourth. But again, it's still metaphor. Yeah, the will then has the self as a possible aim. But the thing is that again, we don't want to be totalizing in our conscious aim, because he said earlier, he said earlier, yeah, it's that it can't be determined unilaterally by one function. For the will must have some content, some aim, and how is this aim set? How else than by an antecedent psychic process? Yeah, so yes, we contribute freely, this will, but it also has a self-willing into being quality. It's a self-generating fire. As in, it's not only that the will has the self as a possible aim, but that the self has the will as a possible aim. Yeah, and the self becomes more possible, this movement, the more any further conflict, any further development is arrested by the conflict. And importantly, yes, we can see that conflict is pretty firmly arrested. So the closer we get to, this is the thing, the closer we get to things really not being able to continue, the more of a value the more possible this remediation between the opposites becomes, which is exactly why all this is coming up now, right? Because it's not just me that's at work here. The obvious question would be who? Who do you mean, Sam? Okay. Yes, he says, in this case, the will does not decide between the opposites. The will does not decide between the opposites, but purely for the self. Yes, and we have to recognize that we're unable to solve the problem. So we decide for the self. And that means, as he says, that is, the disposable energy is withdrawn into the self. In other words, it is introverted. What he means is introverted into the self. The thing is that it also means introverted into the emerging center of conscious awareness. So we would have to there's a sort of giving oneself up and over to a higher power in a sense. Is a self-sacrificial quality. And there's a very Christian structure there. This is a self-sacrifice motif, right? And this is exactly what, as I've written, it's what Jung was doing. It's a fulfilling Christianity without succumbing to it, and not by not regressing to it, by pointing to himself, through himself and beyond himself. So it's being Christ rather than being subservient to Christ or looking up to Christ. Yeah, that also connects with the stuff about Meister Eckhart, which I'm wanting to talk about in the 5th chapter, where it's by moving most deeply into one's own self, into one's personality, that this Atman Brahman correspondence can occur. Yeah, it's also important to clarify here that what happens if abnormal conditions obtain, because they may be at risk of obtaining, right? And I've written there, as I talked about in the episode on this chapter, which I'm doing again, is that under abnormal conditions, the self would have its own value. The symbols have their own value coming through from the unconscious. And in such a case, the self would still be differentiated from the opposites, and the libido would still be detached from those opposites. But I think that would happen insofar as the libido was not disposable by the unconscious, by the consciousness or by the will. So that means that there's a quality of, it could feel like possession. But the thing is that I don't think that's, yeah, healthy, because I mean, as he says, in an abnormal state, a psychic disturbance has supervened. But the thing is that we may just want to know what that is if in case that happens. But I think we're wanting to avoid that by taking up the right attitude beforehand, right? Which is sort of depotentiating the risk, letting the air out of the bag, or other metaphors like that, which I won't name. I've written that in that condition, the will is still important because, but yeah, but subliminal. The will is still vital, but it's in that case, under abnormal conditions, it would be the unconscious creative matrix who has the self as her aim. As well as the disposable energy. I think what I'm connecting with there is that it can be possible to see that Mother Nature, including the unconscious, actually does in fact have the self as her aim. And if we are not willing to recognize that and go along with that process, then we will be booted off. Um, we will be used for her ends as an experiment. The idea would be that as the will, in that case, we still need to we must decide if we wish to give consent to participate in the aim and goal of life, which is to, in that case, to produce the self. Okay. So we can see there that back to normal conditions, the idea would be to recognize that there is a prevailing conflict that cannot be overcome, and then to appeal to this self, which is emerging in and between us. Again, diversity and unity, yeah, particularization and integration, differentiation and unit, yeah, blah blah, all the opposites, and then yeah, by this self-sacrifice, by this self-emptying process, giving over to the self, the energy, the disposable energy, is withdrawn into the self or introverted. The introversion means that the libido is retained by the self and is prevented from taking part in the conflict of opposites. Since the way outward is barred to it, it naturally turns toward thought. I think the important thing here is that there may be a risk that it escapes into the ether, where we could devote all of our free energy and agency to it. It could then take that and then go, like, and like keep going. So the idea would be to how do we get it to like stick around? Because if it introverts all the disposable energy, meaning the will, then it's not really up to us anymore. And this has to do with the alchemical process of sealing the vessel properly first. Or it has to be not just sort of, no, it's not just that it needs to come up from the depths. It needs to be helped to stay here in this realm with us. There's a preventing it from escaping on all four directions, which I will talk about in a different context. He says, since the way outward is barred to it, it naturally turns toward thought, where again is it in danger of getting entangled in the conflict. I'm not sure what that means in this context. Yeah, we're talking about how the will has the self as a possible aim. The will doesn't decide between the opposites. The self then introverts the disposable energy, which means the libido is retained by the self, prevented from taking part in the conflict of opposites. That could mean that it stays in the unconscious, right? So the idea is that it would need to be continually called. It may not be as dependent on us as we think. It's like fishing for a big fish, you know? Anyway, it goes that the act of differentiation and introversion involves the detachment of disposable libido not merely from the outer object, but also from the inner object, the thought. The libido becomes wholly objectless. It is no longer related to anything that could be a content of consciousness. I think this is simply, we can take that in the traditional meaning of introversion, where we have a problem in the outer world, so we revert to sort of talking about it and trying to work out what to do. And this is getting tangled up in um, the conflict of opposites in terms of thought. And this is getting tangled in the conflict where the act of further differentiation and further introversion would be recognizing that the um, detachment of the libido is not just from outer objects and into an introverted state for us, but also detachment from thoughts as well. Again, it's this disidentification from thoughts, feelings, sensation, and intuition. Where he says the libido becomes wholly objectless. It's no longer related to anything that could be a content of consciousness, and it therefore sinks into the unconscious. Yeah, it's like it's where the free directing of the libido, the energy, the will, is not at any of the objects. It's not getting stuck in any of the objects. It's um, moving on from that one and moving on from that one and holding open that creative tension, and it therefore sinks into the unconscious, apparently. Where it automatically takes possession of the waiting fantasy material, which it thereupon activates and forces to the surface. And so it's a recipe, you know. And so I'm about to stop, but I will just do a little bit more. I will keep going actually, because it says, yeah, it then constellates this living form. The symbol is living form. Yes, and that's what we get to talk about in dreams, because it's this constellated fantasy material contains images of the psychological development of the individuality of the self in its successive stages, a sort of preliminary sketch or representation of the onward way between the opposites. And so that's all the natural symbols that have arisen through mankind. And I want to say that these the n-dimensional hyperobjects and geometric structures are part of the transition between conscious and unconscious. I think they're on the borderline of sense-making architecture, and therefore they have to do with this conversion from the introverted stage to the extroverted stage. As in, I wonder what their opposite would be, because it's something like they can have quite a masculine quality in terms of facility with things rather than facility with people. But what I'm getting at there is that maths may be the same for Easterners and Westerners, introverts and extroverts. But I don't know. Anyway, it says with Jung, although it may frequently happen that the discriminating activity of consciousness does not find much in these images that can be immediately understood, these intuitions, and even these ones, these intuitions nevertheless contain a living power which can have a determining effect on the will. Yeah, but the trouble is that when the will is set right by this living symbol of the self, the opposites then recover their strength. The conflict shows up again. And so it's an eternally renewing source. It's a source of life. It's a wellspring. And that constant mediation, it's going back down into the depths and up again. This is what he calls the transcendent function, which got turned into what he called the process of individuation. Yes, besides the will, whose importance on that should not on that count be denied, we also have creative fantasy, an irrational instinctive function, which alone has the power to supply the will with a content of such a nature that it can unite the opposites. This is the function that Schiller intuitively apprehended as the source of symbols. We've moved over to the next page, struggling to get toward the end here, where importantly, part of what we're wondering is the right attitude here. We're again, in terms of the problem of 3 and 4, how should the will dispose itself? And the idea was for the will as masculine, let's say, to humble itself, to lower itself before the divine feminine. So waking it and bringing it into consciousness. And what we're hoping to do is get the right kind of loop going rather than the wrong kind of loop. I think where we can see from out of our consciousness, we dispose our will humbly and with reverence to the, let's say, unconscious feminine self, or the unconscious. Um, and this relates to the material on page 116 and 17, where there's an emptying of the will, right? It's a not being too overdetermined and turning what the will, this is what I meant by the solar plexus, into an aperture through which it's like a clear glass, clearing the dross, allowing the pool to settle such that unconscious material can speak for itself. This is kind of lowering of the masculine before the feminine. But then the hope is that we, the hope is that by doing that, that it's not black magic, but is instead, I think that the thing there would be in terms of right orientation, where it's not just the will is humbling itself or lowering itself, but it's the lowering itself too of what is unconscious, and that includes toward us, right? Toward the towards everything that's represented by the four. Um, we're hoping to do that in a way which is appropriate and not putting ourselves in a very vulnerable position, where there's a kind of reciprocity that can be built in the sense of gift economy, non-transactional. Yeah, it's about it would be about continually being willing to disidentify with the pairs of opposites that come up. So if it's self and other, it's going to be quite confronting, right? Because it's going to be confrontation with the other. So then there's a holding the tension between self and other within a willing space, um, where we can recognize that we are other to that self, and that we are self to that other. Um, and but that we're also neither. And that by holding those open, um, well, a personality would emerge. A living form. Would it not, in the sense that all personalities are emergent properties of emerge as a function of relationship, right? Hmm. The thing is that it's simultaneously we as conscious masculine lowering ourselves with humility to be open and clear before the, and this is what they mean about this coming into this state of indeterminacy, emptiness of content in the will, um, disidentification from the opposites. Um, so there's this again. It's a singular, singular meaning unified emptiness and indeterminacy, which allows for this full active multiplicity to speak through us. It feels dangerous though, you know? So how is it right attitude there? Yeah, I think that that willing attitude also ends up being taking on the role of the feminine and sort of being spoken to by the unconscious, quote unquote, by God. Um, yeah, something positive is to result directly from this condition. Um, in any case, the thing that I want to suggest here is that that it's not, I think, because I think like to me, all of that is clearly one half, because there are these qualities of, hey, we need to be in this um empty and passive unity so that this full active multiplicity can speak through us. And I'm like, yeah, but we're conscious and unconscious, right? And so it's not just differentiating or stepping back from, it's also making sure that we can step into all these different pairs of opposites. And that's why I've written that the can we recognize ourselves in that emerging center of consciousness? And can we allow ourselves to participate rather than step back and away? Um, it's a quality of active engagement with, yeah, because this emphasis on differentiation from the pairs of opposites. The key thing there is that we need the capacity to disidentify from them, but still participate in them. So it's this facility with pairs of opposites. Um, that it really requires both. It's both and neither. I guess the mistake would be to there's an usually an over-identifying with one where we then see the other, where we would need to then recognize, oh, I'm caught in this duality, this because it recurs, right? It's a deeply built-in structure. So if we can notice, oh, I'm caught in this duality, I can then step into it and out of it at will. I'm just very wary of getting caught in if we can only step out of these dichotomies, then that's a problem because we need to be able to step into them because shamanic logic is um, evolving by becoming, and becoming requires participation in different perspectives. So it's a capacity to take up different perspectives here. Can we take up the perspective of the other that we're like if we're seeing a dichotomy from one side, well, can we take up the perspective of the other? And can we take up the perspective of the witness, which is witnessing both? But the witness can cause this dualistic detachment that is itself another one of these opposites, right? That I think this is evidence of Jung's overemphasis on the introversion. Again, I think this is the reason for the focus on the symbols, because the symbols are the structures that reunify and combine all this beyond our ability to keep distinguishing and defining and getting it wrong in our defining. But I think we can safely say that there is an important, really important part of this is a self-emptying process. Um, for me, there's a recognizing that, yeah, it's a shedding the ego and stepping into the identity of the soul, stepping more into one's uniqueness, stepping more into one's individuality. But then, apart from the fullness of one's individuality, there's also a recognition of oneself in no thingness or shunyata. So there's an inherent emptiness, but it's not the emptiness of privation; it's the emptiness of fullness. And this is where the stuff from Viveki comes in so handy, right? Because I've talked at length in that series on dialectic and dialogus and pragmatic and no thingness in a time of crisis, that until we get the sociological conditions, until it can be lived, it's very dangerous to do this. It's not just a matter of practice, it's a matter of life itself, life and death even. And I talked about specific vulnerabilities in that at that place, but I think it's this, what I'm emphasizing is that there's this interweaving of um, who one is and who one isn't, what one can and what one can't within personhood, um, where, yeah, that ameliorates nihilism by allowing us to identify with what we're not, with our inner emptiness, within our inner even inadequacy limitation. I won't go on about that here, but just to say that for this stuff, yeah, don't get stuck on one side, because I think it's all very well to say, hey, we need to be in this passive unity that's like a clear screen. But the whole thing about Western people is that we have so much in our unconscious that wants to come out and through us, and we've got to be very careful about what exactly we're doing. So I think there's some focusing on the symbols here, which is really required. But certainly there's this self-emptying and a refulfilling process. Okay. I think here, one thing that I got is that, yes, it's from the point of view of the three, from the masculine, there's a self-emptying and making oneself like submitting and opening oneself to be filled. But then there's also, we can then refer back to the felt sense, where if there's a danger of possession, then that's going to be really draining and not feel good, right? But there's also an idea where it says this empty state. No, I won't. It says this fullness, the counterpart of the emptiness of consciousness, can only be the content of the unconscious, since no other content is given. Schiller is expressing the union of conscious and unconscious. From this state, something positive is to result. This positive something is for us a symbolic determinant of the will. A little tricky there to say, but it's kind of like this thing where we're not just contributing all of our life force to a symbol which is outside of us. We're entering into a dynamic reciprocal relationship with a self, with ourself, that we are then revivified and nourished by. Yes, where we could feel that, right? So it's not just that we, contribute our voluntary energy to the uncovering of these implicit geometric structures and symbols which are full of life in themselves. It's that there's this the three, the will, which is coming from the unconscious rather than our consciously disposable will. So where the unconscious is in the masculine position, we, the feminine, inhabit this quality of being the natural forms. We are the natural forms. So where we are living symbols we are then filled with life force. We are inspired. Also thinking of, and I want to look up a word. I would say we're looking for the quality of being enthused, in the sense of enthusiasm, meaning from the Greek enthusiasmos, divine inspiration or being possessed by a god. Yeah, I think we're looking for something like that, filled with the god. Entheos is an entheogen, but it's not just that. It's also inspiration, right? Coming from in and spire, Latin, breathe into. Inspire, breathe or flow into, where the Zen phrase is, when I breathe out, the universe breathes in. When I breathe in, the universe breathes out. So there's a quality of being literally inspired, being breathed by life. Yeah, close to the borderline, close to the the semi-permeable membrane of life itself. Yeah, I think these are qualities to look out for. It's a renewal of vitality. It's a source of energy. Contributes to us as we contribute to it. There's a reciprocal relating. I think in 117, page 117, we can see that if there are two opposites that cancel each other out within consciousness, which I think the symptom of which may be aporia, there's a void produced, and Jung refers to that as the unconscious. The thing is that he thinks that there's still the battle between the opposites is still present within the unconscious, and so there may be the idea that we need to unify or mediate the battle between the opposites, not only in the conscious but also the unconscious halves of the personality. Very tricky and very dangerous to start messing around in that way because we would get messed with as well. There may be something like an idea that the self is in some way trapped by a battle within the unconscious, um, and that it needs the help of the conscious hero. And the idea would be that we are in some way trapped by the conscious, by the conflict between the opposites within the conscious realm, and that the self can in some way support us. Um, I'll have to draw that at a different time. But there we can finally see that it is these the reason for the inadequacy of this cancelling of the opposites in the conscious space and the resulting aporia is it's a susceptible condition. It's the aesthetic condition. So this is my reason for this. It's not just about producing voidhood. It's about participating in the opposites just as much as stepping back from them. And Jung talks about this on page 117 as because it is not determined by the opposites, this condition is susceptible to every determinant. There may be advantages to that. Like if you can enter into this voidness, then things can spontaneously arise. That can help us to see what it is that's going on. It can help us to diagnose and identify. But the thing is there that we can finally see that it's this, we don't want to ultimately stay in that voidhood. We want to be able to, yes, detach from pairs of opposites, but also to be able to re-participate in them, and with both, right? Which is a deeper kind of participation. It's a stepping into, down and among, rather than out and into the aesthetic condition. Yes, and this, we don't want to get stuck in the introversion, where introversion is kind of equivalent to actually, no, it's not connected with introversion there, because introversion is a deeper participation in the conflict. Yeah, sort of Schiller is then fishing around for something else that it is other than the aesthetic character, and Jung says he should have returned to it being about symbols, because but the symbol has the quality of being related to all psychic functions without being a specific object for any single one. Yeah, so I think that the symbols that come up end up being this channel of communication between the conscious and the unconscious, and if they can be understood and worked with, then there can be a deeper engagement with the unconscious that may be necessary if there is an unconscious conflict between opposites, just as much as there is a conscious conflict between opposites. Yeah, and so there's a kind of mediatory disposition, which I've talked about in other contexts as well, where it's about this quality of attitude, not only about humility, but allowing things to flow between. It's an amiable or agapic attitude that allows whatever perspectives are needing to be present, to be voiced. Having now reached this mediatory disposition, Schiller perceives that it is henceforth possible for man, by way of nature, to make of himself what he will. The freedom to be what he ought to be is completely restored to him. And on that, this is a way to the realization, the self-realization of free will. It's a man as a self-creating being. And on that, I would really mention Pico di Mirandola, who you should definitely look up. And he said he wrote something really cool, Oration on the Dignity of Man, dignity, where dignity is kind of the deepest basis of the humility, I think. Because I think there's a dignity in one's natural form as a living person, living being, living human. And that when we humble ourselves before the unconscious forces, we still retain the dignity of our natural form. And so, Oration on the Dignity of Man, yes, very much, as connected with free will, reads, Thou, constrained by no limits, in accordance with thine own free will, in whose hand we have placed thee, shall ordain for thyself the limits of thy nature. We have made thee neither of heaven nor of earth, neither mortal nor immortal, so that with freedom of choice and with honor, as though the maker and molder of thyself, thou mayest fashion thyself in whatever shape thou shalt prefer. Yeah, and it is these symbols which really lay at the central location, the central point. Um, yep. And again, it's these primordial images appear, which he says, yeah, they're not as aesthetic. They have these symbols of the self, which Jung analyzes in dreams. This is what I've been trying to get to the entire time, finally, is that Jung says the primordial image I'm thinking of is that particular configuration of Eastern ideas, which is condensed in the Brahman Atman teaching of India, and whose philosophical spokesman in China is Lao Tzu. Yeah, the thing is that it's this, we can understand these symbols of the self, right? But we're not wanting to go back into the introverted condition of the Easterners, which I don't think Jung has the right view of that. But there's a weird catch-22 where sort of Jung is sort of misconceiving of the Eastern conceptions as introversion, but they're not, because they have wu wei, right? The kind of action which is non-action. It doesn't just imply sitting in a cave, like there are like householders, for example, in Buddhism. But the thing is that I think we can see that the entire history, in a way, of humankind is, in some sense, an introverted condition, and that the self symbols that are cross-culturally, I think that the symbols of the self that are found the world over and cross-culturally and through history and like that, I think the highest spiritual development so far is, in a sense, Eastern, Indian and Chinese. But I think it is fair to say that the Western canon has a facility with extroversion, with the expression of love to the object, rather than I mean, so with the Easterners have this withdrawal of libido toward or away from subject and object, it's just that I don't want to reduce. I mean, even the characterization of Eastern and Western is not really one that, I mean, I haven't even talked about the Sufis at all. This is why we talk to John, right? Because I don't know. But that allows us to finally stop with this problem of 3 and 4. It says, yeah, the purpose of life is to travel this middle road and never to deviate toward the opposites. The ecstatic element is entirely absent in Lao Tzu. Oh, blah, blah. It goes on about how wrong he is about Lao Tzu, but that allows us to finally clarify the nature of this problem of 3 and 4 in terms of the material from chapter 2. We talked about the importance of the uniting symbol. We talked about the conscious and unconscious. We talked about the correct attitude of the will toward the symbols. Talked about a great deal. And I think I will I'm now able to move into finally this Brahmanic conceptions of the problem of opposites, where we can realize that this is what we've been trying to bring to consciousness the entire time, and that we can, by realizing this, begin to realize this conversion from the introverted condition into bringing it into the world and speaking it into being and being spoken by it, and establishing this Ouroboros self-generating loop of self and world, which is what we will pursue next time. And well done, champion, for getting through this. I hope you're proud of yourself.